and into the speaker.
Oh, okay. So I'll hand this over to the,
Anybody on the Zoom won't hear you without the microphones.
without the microphone.
Yes.
Okay.
So there's
And with the microphones, still hear you.
Yeah, with the microphones, they won't hear you if you don't have a microphone. They'll only hear you with the microphone.
Oh, okay. Yeah, so the opposite of what I just said.
Yeah.
Great, thanks. And this little switch right here is now on.
Yep.
Okay.
Slow things.
Zoom.
Oh, that's right. Are we live? Nice. Wow. We're doing questions right after each one. I was sure. Yeah.
The baseball question demonstrated. They're not going to.
Sad that they must not have the latest version.
Sorry, I can't hear.
Formatting is graphic. It's okay between that and
Wow.
why divided. Just image. You every day. No, I'm not. I'm gonna stand up. Get like a.
No. I always.
Figure it out, yeah. Like,
Yeah.
so this is what I use every conference for. It's supposed to be getting my credit. So like. we get a Gonna write on my like getting that kind of like. Match up. You get to the time on the next one.
That involves. Yeah. Bring like the inside of that. It's like a lot of it.
Yeah. Anyway. Well, that's like, you know, but I feel like there's an opportunity to bring it to then also, you know, like. Yeah. Yeah. You know, 30-minute Zoom or something like that. We even take them through something that's like this, that maybe I could even recite. So that they know where that number is. Yeah, and all the
Oh, yeah.
That's what I mean, like, release sort of thing. If we- Yeah, but I'd like to do that as a research evidence. So before we even get the report to talking about efficiency or equity, we show wildly impactful. right? We're just talking about making it better. We already have the part of it. Not only interviewing young people, but it went like. Yeah. Like, so excited. Yeah, and I said, yeah.
We're gonna get started. So we are beginning session number 2. So this presentation is called Intersections of Economic and Workforce Development. I am Lou Mandarini. I work for Mayor Michelle Wu as a labor policy advisor. Longtime labor and employment lawyer, come out of the employee benefits world and sort of do all things with labor policy and workforce for the mayor. So I'm going to serve as the moderator today, which is basically just keeping things on track and introducing presenters, trying to talk less so you can talk more. And that will be my role. We have with us Natalia Uribe, who will be the provocateur. Natalia.
I don't know if I need this. Do you need it for the Zoom people? Hi, everybody. No, sure. Hi, everybody. My name is Natalia Uribe. I currently serve as a fellow at the Eastern Bank Foundation, and that is a fun term to say that I serve as the expert to lead the strategy around small business for our foundation. I come from the city of Boston. I worked with Mayor Walsh previously, Mayor Kim Janey, and Mayor Wu. And I worked in lots of different capacities, from running the citywide planning process, Imagine Boston 2030, back in 2015, and most recently as a director of small business before and during the pandemic. So it's been a whirlwind of events. I'm really excited to be here. My job is to push, so I am a friendly person, but I am going to be pushing these guys a little bit to really get into dialogue and a conversation around solutions and next steps. Yep.
Okay. So let's talk a little bit about the flow today. So we've got, unfortunately, one of our presenters has dropped out. The presenter, Mass Inc., that was going to present some polling around return to work in the pandemic. So if you came for that one, you're out of luck. But stay anyway, because we have 3 great presenters on 3 diverse topics. That's true. You may say to yourself that you know there's a great deal of diversity in this program, and since we know each other so well, I'm going to acknowledge that these things are sort of grouped together loosely. But we're going to let the presenters do their thing, and then we're going to have about 5 to 7 minutes of conversation questions after each of the presenters, maybe somewhere on the order of 15 to 20 minutes each, about that specific presentation, so that we can engage and you can ask questions, have discussion, that kind of a thing. And then after the 3, we'll have a more open and freewheeling conversation, tying together the threads of all 3, or not tying together the threads of all 3, if that's what we end up deciding to do. So the one thing I would say, both for the discussion and the conversation after the presentation, and then for the 30 minutes or so at the end, you know, let's be respectful, let's be civil. And I think the one important rule is let's not filibuster, let's not make speeches. Questions, comments, discussion, colloquy back and forth is great, but sort of holding forth as if it's the US Senate, not great. So with that, let's go ahead and start with our first group of presenters. So City of Boston is going to assert personal privilege and have our first presenters, which deal with a very important initiative for us and for the youth of Boston. Our first presentation is called Building a More Holistic Workforce Development System for Boston's Youth. And we have two presenters who are going to help us with this. Dr. Alicia Modestino from Northeastern and Rashad Cope, our Deputy Cabinet Chief for the Worker Empowerment Cabinet in the city. Do you want to introduce yourselves directly and then start? Or, yeah.
Hey, good afternoon, everyone. As Lou mentioned, Rashad Cope, Deputy Chief with the Worker Empowerment Cabinet, and also the Office of Youth Employment and Opportunity. And essentially, within the city, my role largely is to provide oversight of workforce readiness programs and initiatives to advance the lives of Boston's young people. That's around youth jobs, that's around access to skill and career development, educational training, and also strategic partnerships with a number of community-based organizations, small businesses, and stakeholders within the city of Boston as well.
Thanks. I'm Alicia Modestino. I am an associate professor at Northeastern University in the School of Public Policy and Urban Affairs. I'm a labor economist by training. I've been working with City of Boston in a research practice partnership for 8 years now, working closely to evaluate the Summer Youth Employment Program along with a bunch of other different initiatives. And then I'm currently also leading something at Northeastern called City to City, which is an initiative to provide the infrastructure both inside the university as well as to our policy partners to do community engaged research. So if you're interested in more about that, we can talk afterwards. I'm going to launch into this. Is that? Oh, sure. Okay.
Everybody have their moment in the sun, and then we can start with the actual presentation. So our second presenter, Nick Caros. Am I saying that right, Nick? Yeah. Do you want to introduce yourself and introduce the?
Sure, thanks. My name's Nick. I'm a student here at MIT, but actually in the transportation program, not in the media lab. And I've been working mostly with transit agencies over the 4 years that I've been here. MIT holds research partnerships with the T, but also Chicago, Washington, D.C., New York, San Francisco. So I've had the pleasure of working with all those different agencies, mostly looking at how remote work is affecting the demand for public transit, and then also what public transit agencies can do about it. But actually today, I'm going to be kind of stepping outside of that and talking more about land use solutions to dealing with the new demand for remote work and how people are traveling around the city.
And then our last presenter, Monson.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. My name is Mohsen. I am a research scientist at MIT, connection science, and my research field is computational social science. It means using large scale data sets from different sources to understand people's behavior and use it for future prediction or decision making, supporting for governments, business owners, and people. And today I will talk about the recovery of restaurants in Boston greater area and also New York City after the pandemic. Thank you.
Bring it full circle with Alicia and Michelle to do our first presentation.
Great, thank you. I'm going to do my professor thing because that's the only way I know how to present. So just in case you're wondering, what is the Summer Youth Employment Program? It sounds like pretty obvious, but you probably might want to know some of the details about it. This is actually a program that's gone on for decades. There are also large summer youth employment programs in New York, Chicago, and DC, and smaller ones all across the United States, across about 50 or so cities in the US. Boston's been employing upwards of 10,000 young people every summer since the early 1990s. These are largely youth who are 14 to 24 years old. They work for 6 weeks in the summer, largely right after July 4th through the middle of August. They're paid the minimum wage, whatever the prevailing minimum wage is in that year. And they're placed in a job, could be with a city agency, could be with a community-based organization, could be with a private sector employer. And they're also provided some additional career readiness curriculum that includes things like job readiness skills, how to search for a job, soft skills, job safety, et cetera, things like that. Our research partner with City of Boston has shown, oh, there we go. It's all going to fill in eventually. So we've been doing this work with City of Boston since the 2015, and we've had this longstanding research practice partnership that's demonstrated the program's really highly effective, right? So it has huge impacts on not just criminal justice, but also academic and employment outcomes for young people. And what's unique in Boston is that not only do we generate this research evidence off of administrative records, so school records, criminal justice records, employment records, but we also combine it with a pre-post survey where we're asking young people, what are the things that they learned during the summer? And that tells us something a little bit about the mechanisms behind these impacts. So for example, in terms of crime, the improvements that we see, so there's a 30% reduction in violent and property crime, that's linked to the soft skills that young people are learning during the summer. So everything from learning to manage their emotions, resolve conflicts with a peer, ask adults for help. We also find impacts on academic outcomes that are linked to increasing academic aspirations as well as work habits. So there's about a 5 percentage point increase in high school graduation rates. This is very closely tied to improvements in attendance in the year after participating in the program. So for example, when I ask young people in a focus group, what did you learn this summer? The first thing they say is, well, geez, if you're going to be 5 minutes late, don't show up at all. Apparently that's not something you learn in school, but you learn it on the job because you're not going to be working there much longer if you don't show up on time. We also find that the private sector jobs increase the likelihood of taking the SAT and also attending college, and in particular, moving from a 2-year to a 4-year college, increasing those academic aspirations. And then finally, we do find that it also increases the likelihood of having a job in the 1 to 2 years after participating in the program, particularly for youth of color. And all of this research evidence is based off of a randomized control trial. So prior to the pandemic, all the jobs were randomly assigned. So there's a very well-balanced treatment and control group underneath all of this research evidence. So what are we doing now? So what's the look forward here with this new partnership with the city? So we have an institutional challenge grant from William T. Grant Foundation. And in the spirit of building back better after the pandemic, we're looking to make improvements to the program. So during the pandemic, you may not know this, but the City of Boston Summer Youth Employment Program actually operates off of an ecosystem. It's not just the City of Boston. It's also large intermediaries like the Boston Private Industry Council, nonprofit organizations like Action for Boston Community Development, other city agencies like Youth Options Unlimited that works with court-involved youth, and also private entities like MLK Scholars, which is funded by John Hancock. And so during the pandemic, those entities came together, developed 4 new tracks of programming, and all of that research evidence was taken to Mayor Walsh, who invested an extra $4 million of CARES Act funding into the program during that summer, and in particular to stand up 2 new tracks. One was a Learn and Earn program where young people were paid to take community college courses, meaning the course was paid and their time to take it was paid, because all of our research evidence had shown that half of our young people were paying some kind of household bill with their summer earnings. So they're paying rent, utilities, groceries, cell phone. I mean, I would love it if my kids would pay their own cell phone bill, right? So they're contributing to their households. In contrast, other cities like New York, where it's a very top-down program, all coming from the city, canceled their programs during summer 2020 and left 75,000 young people unemployed. So coming out of the pandemic, we developed this new partnership, and we have sort of a research agenda that we're moving through here. Everything from increasing coordination alignment across that ecosystem. You can imagine the pandemic revealed some of the vulnerabilities in that, as well as evaluating some of the program features in terms of job matching, the quality of jobs, being able to ladder those jobs from one summer to the next to increase skill development, expanding some of those post-secondary opportunities under that Learn and Earn program, and also how do we link the summer jobs program to other year-round programming, right? It's a very impactful 6-week program. And then at the end of the summer, we say, see ya, whereas we could, right, continue those employment opportunities into year-round employment or link them up to other opportunities if they're graduating, like the tuition-free community college program. So in our first year, we really spent a lot of time in this planning year doing a systems mapping of the entire ecosystem, and then also doing an efficiency and an equity audit, right? So the program's very impactful, but there's always been, sort of ways that we can improve the processes that really got revealed during the pandemic. And so I'm going to preview some of those results for you today, and we'll be releasing a report in the next month or so. In terms of the efficiency audit, so like many other cities that have moved away from random assignment, especially since the pandemic, there's actually an interesting matching problem that happens with trying to get young people into jobs and also through the entire hiring and onboarding process. And because it's of that complexity, there's often jobs that even if a young person was selected for it, at the end of the selection process, sometimes they're not always hired into it. And because of that, in terms of efficiency, right? For example, in these direct jobs, so these are jobs where the employer partner, usually a city agency, is relying on the city to do all of the hiring and onboarding and payroll for that hire. Last summer, there are about 3,400 openings that were allotted to those direct jobs. About 2,800 young people were hired into them, and that left about 564 of those job openings without a young person who was hired into them. So on average, there's about 10 to 15% of these job slots that are unfilled. You might say, what's the big deal, right? But that's money left on the table. That's community-based organizations that maybe aren't getting the summer help that they rely on. And then also a young person, right, who could be filling that job. We should also mention that there's two other types of positions here. So a grant type position is when the city grants out their funding to an organization, usually a community-based organization, or even this year, Northeastern's going to be a partner. And when that happens, then it's the employer partner who is the one responsible for doing all the hiring and onboarding and payrolling. And you can see even when we grant out those dollars, right, the grant partners are facing the same challenges that the city is in terms of getting young people into jobs, right? And then there's also a bucket of money for programs like the Learn and Earn program and things like that. The other thing that I wanted to highlight is why do we have sort of this inefficiency? There's an interesting matching problem that happens inside the summer jobs program. And what we did last summer is we collected all of the application data from the city of Boston and looked at where young people were placed and how they were hired and had this sort of snapshot every single week. And what we find is that young people typically apply to only one job. They're like wildly overconfident. My teenagers are the same way. They're like, yes, I've applied for a job. I'm done. It doesn't really work that way, right? We all know that. The other thing is that they tend to bunch up and apply to particularly popular jobs, right? So I gave you kind of two examples here of why this is such a problem. So right here for the Dorchester YMCA, you get 355 young people applying for 33 positions. If most young people are applying for only one position, that's going to leave a lot of youth who are not hired, right? On the other side, you have the BCYF Perkins Center, which is only getting 3 applicants for 20 positions, right? So there's a high degree of mismatch that's happening here that the city and other agencies have to resolve. The second thing is that the onboarding and hiring process is very complex. So I'm showing you what the process is over here. You can just look at the number of boxes and nod that it's very, very complicated. My graduate student had a hard time getting through this the first time to get hired by SuccessLink to be a partner with them. And what happens is that even, so the program starts by July 6th, right? Even several weeks after the program, there's about 15% of the young people who can't get through that onboarding process and get hired. The other point that we wanted to highlight was also the equity audit that we did. So once you move away from random assignment and allow employers to pick 100% of their young people, it's probably not too surprising that they replicate all the inequities that we see in the labor market. They're much more likely to hire white youth. They're much more likely to hire youth from the prestigious exam schools. And yet this is a developmental program. So that is not what we are aiming for. And to their credit, when we brought this research evidence to the city, they didn't say like, oh, wow, like either we don't believe that or we don't want to hear that, but said, great, help us fix it. So we designed a job matching algorithm last summer, and we stratified it by race and school type to make sure that at the end of the day, the distribution of the youth who were hired was matching the distribution of youth who applied. And so this is just showing you selected by site. This is the employer selections. You can see that they're hiring fewer or selecting fewer African-American applicants compared to the total distribution. And you can see these are the ones that we selected with a job matching algorithm that's overcompensating for that. So I'm going to hand it over to Rashad because we developed this report that included a whole set of recommendations that the city is following based on this research evidence to improve both the efficiency and the equity of the program.
Thanks, Alicia. I'm going to run through these next 3 slides fairly quickly. So my role or our role as a city of Boston, our role from a practitioner angle of the research and evaluation partnership is to really help Alicia and the Northeastern team, right, make sense of the data that they're analyzing, and speak on behalf of our stakeholders and provide a contextual lens around the work, really to address the inequities that Alicia just mentioned, to increase alignment and coordination, and to also just focus on our stakeholders and improving outcomes and program quality. So we work together to develop a process improvement plan. We're going to walk through just a few pieces of that process improvement plan here. It's helpful to understand how the program works, right? So we're going to discuss very quickly application and selection process, onboarding and job quality, and alignment and coordination. So with the recruitment and application process, so this is a city-wide effort to inform young people across the city of Boston that youth jobs are now available, right? And applications are open to any young person that is interested in participating in the city's youth job program. This happens across the ecosystem. The next piece is the selection, the matching, and the placement process. So young people can apply to jobs in multiple ways. They'll apply. The employer, and then in this sense, it can be the community-based organization or the private sector company. They engage in a discussion with the young person. They vet all the candidates. As Alicia mentioned, there could be, 30, 40, upwards to over 100 applicants for each of these employers. So they vet the young people and they make their selections. We as a city have also implemented an equity placement system as well, in which we would fill 30% of the slots, and that 30% would be filled with young people who apply to jobs and are not selected by organizations. So with the recruitment and application process, one of the issues we found here is that among those youth who completed the application, more than half applied to only one job. And this happens because young people are pretty confident that the job that they apply to is the job that they actually will get selected for. That doesn't always happen, right? So we realized that this created a number of just unfilled positions, as Alicia actually showed in her research. So some of the ways in which we were looking to address that is, one, just adding a searchable table. So when young people are searching the jobs, they can search the jobs by location, they can search the jobs by occupation, industry, and then, which we're hoping that makes it easier for young people to apply, and then sending text messages and emails to young people, encouraging them to apply to more than one job. We found that pretty effective because young people are not responsive to email, but young people are very responsive to text messages as well. And in some cases, we also sent those text messages to their parents as well. And then with the selection and matching process, Alicia already talked about, that some of these jobs reproduce the inequities. So we'll jump past that one. With the onboarding process here, among positions where young people were selected for a job, about 15% are unable to complete the hiring process, right? So we understand how much of a challenge this is. And this happens because young people are asked to pull together a number of hiring documents, maybe some of the same documents that each and every one of you all had to submit when you all were hired and onboarded for your job. So we were looking at a few ways to address this. One, we did expand the grant making program, right, by transferring the administrative responsibility away from the city over to our employers, over to our partner organizations. And that helps decentralize the hiring process. So each employer would pretty much just manage the hiring, vetting, and the payroll of young people. And then we've also expanded in terms of just job quality here, we also realize that not all job experiences provide the same developmental opportunities for young people to learn new skills and to move up the ladder. So the focus here was to really think about creating a tiered job system that ladders job opportunities from entry level or more skilled positions, both across the ecosystem. And also to think about skills mapping and categorizing jobs and developing criteria of improving job quality as well. And then going quickly through this, Lou. And then the last two pieces here was around the ecosystem coordination. So although the decentralized nature of the Summer Youth Jobs Program, it was pretty resilient throughout the pandemic. There is a need for greater coordination and alignment amongst all the partners. So we have been conducting just regular meetings of our summer youth employment ecosystem partners to really just identify common themes and share best practices. And then the last piece here is really around just citywide coordination. And I was having this conversation with someone earlier today. Youth development systems just here in Boston, pretty siloed. There's youth jobs programming happening, within BPS, within other sectors. And our focus is to think about ways in which we can coordinate, even at the state level, coordinate citywide resources to make sure that there's a holistic approach and a holistic strategy around addressing youth work here in the city. And I think I will end with just making a note that like this research, it absolutely just offers like tremendous value for our cabinet right here in the city. It provides Boston really with an opportunity to provide leadership, strategic action, and mobilize a number of partners to really focus on an issue that we feel is critical in the city of Boston. When we think about just the intersection of workforce and economic development, we have to continue to make sure our young people are a part of that conversation because we all know that young people definitely are our future workforce. So I'll stop there.
So we're going to spend about 5 minutes with questions, comments, concerns based on that presentation. If you would be good enough when you speak, just to introduce yourself and tell us where you're from. I'm going to hand it off to Natalia first to see if she feels like provoking anyone.
Well, I think I'm going to go last because I want to hear the questions that come up.
That's provocative. Question or comment? Anything they want to ask?
Matt Frank, I'm the Supportive Services Manager and Special Projects Coordinator at the Chelsea Housing Authority. I forgot where I worked for a second. It's because I saw you. I used to work under you. I'm not with Main Streets. My question is for youth that already had jobs before something like this came up. I know I myself started working at 15, and I never really had an opportunity to do these, more exciting projects. And my concern is when it's only 6 weeks during the summertime, how do we get people who already have jobs, who are already supporting their families and what they're doing into these sorts of fields so then they can grow from there? Thank you.
Yeah, I'll jump in and Alicia can add as well. So I think the goal here is to make sure that this program is open to any young person, mostly that has not held, a job, outside of the summer jobs program. But those folks that do have year-round opportunities, we do expect that they can use this as a way to explore different industries and different occupations as well. So I really think it's just trying to do a better job of just, aligning, the opportunities that young people do have and making sure that, if they're working within retail, if they have if they're working within hospitality, right, that they still see this program as an opportunity in which they can continue to learn and develop skills.
I guess the other thing that I would say is for young people who have never held a job, this program is the way that they get their foot in the door in the labor market. It's really, really hard if you're a 14 or 15-year-old to get a job. My own kids who have grown up, now they're all in college and beyond. When they were 15, as white kids in the suburbs, they couldn't get a summer job, right? So this is a critical way to give kids that entry point where they learn those basic skills of showing up on time, learning to work in a team, how to conduct yourself at the work site. And then that sets them up for some of those private sector opportunities. The other thing that I would say is there's a progression even within the program, right? So a lot of the 14 and 15-year-olds start with the day camp and the summer camp jobs, right? And those are pretty basic entry-level positions. And then the following summer, they'll move on to a job with a community-based organization, right? Or a nonprofit doing something that's more hands-on or leadership. And then by the time they're a rising junior or senior, they're getting a private sector position, right? And I'm talking like they're working at Mass General Hospital. They're working at, Sanofi Genzyme. I mean, these are real like career sector type jobs. And that's where we get that impact in terms of the college going increase, as well as moving from a 2-year to a 4-year. And so I think it's critical what Rashad and his team are doing now in terms of getting the word out about what these opportunities are, that there's even an opportunity for learn and earn, so that young people and their families can see what that progression is. Because when times are good right now, right, when there's a lot of job opportunities and employers are paying high wages and they're looking to teenagers as potential workers, it's hard maybe to convince young people to take this opportunity. But the other thing is to remember is that this program's there also when we're in recessions, right? And when nobody is hiring young people as well. So I think that there was a little bit of a challenge, like when you are in a strong job market, to make sure that you get that message across. And that's a lot of what his team's doing right now.
Anybody else have questions, comments about this?
Hi, sorry. My name is Peter. I work for the Massachusetts Data Office, which is part of the state government. One thing I'm interested in is what's being done now or could be done to deal with the mismatch by making sure that all of the descriptions are sort of, optimized, made as desirable as they can be, whether there are specific trends in which jobs don't get a lot of applicants. And, I get that some of them are just objectively less desirable, but maybe some of it is because they're not, advertised as well. So just curious about that.
Yeah, I think just a quick response to that. We have probably between 150 to 200 employer partner organizations, right? And every one of these organizations designs their own job program, therefore they're designing their own job descriptions, right? And we have seen some incredible job descriptions, and we've seen some job descriptions that we feel need some additional work as well. And one strategy that we are continuing to think through is whether or not we can host a employer academy, right, to just walk folks through just how do you maximize the impact, as an employer when you're engaging with young people. And then within that, it helps folks develop strong job descriptions, that are attracting the young people that they're looking to attract as well. So I would say.
The last thing I'll say about that is it might sound like, putting up that table on the website with being searchable by occupation or industry or location sounds small potatoes. But before that, young people had to go into the city's hiring system, and it was not searchable by anything whatsoever, and except for the employer name. And so you get those kinds of mismatches because they only know the, Roxbury Teen Center that is down the street from them, right? And so they can search on that name, maybe a couple other employer names that they know, and that was it. So this was a big innovation to take that information out of the system and put it on the website to be able to be searchable. The other thing that I've learned in this whole mismatch thing is that young people do not search for jobs the way the rest of us do. They were even walking around the job fair last week, they look for, is this inside or outside work? right? Like they want to be outside in the summer doing something. They want to know the location, right? Like, is it easy for me to get to? And do I know and trust this employer, right? So there's, I think, a lot more to go into this matching algorithm than the simple thing that we were doing. And that's some of what we're iterating and looking at the job quality and collecting the skills and things like that. So in addition to writing those job descriptions better, we're learning a lot about how people look for jobs and then how to make it so that we can thicken that job market and be able to match more young people to positions.
In the interest of time, we're going to move on to our second presentation from Nick Caros about community workspace deserts.
Okay, well, thank you very much. So I'm going to switch gears here a little bit and talk more about the economic development side rather than workforce development. But this is a really cool opportunity for me, actually, because this is very much still a work in progress. And I have an engineering background. Mostly what I try to do is come up with tools to solve problems. And I kind of leave it to all of you, the sort of smart, policy-oriented people, to figure out what kind of problems to solve and what the values we should apply when we're trying to solve those problems. So as I get towards the end of the presentation, I'll actually leave you all with a question for you, which is to say, you know, what kind of values should we be applying when we're using these kind of tools that we're developing here? So is there a clicker as well? Thank you very much. Okay, so yeah, I'll be talking about what I'm calling community workspace deserts, and then how we can try to address those, and using Greater Boston as a case study. So to sort of motivate the problem, one thing that you see often in the discussion around remote work is that people use the term remote work and working from home as sort of synonymous with each other. But that's actually not really what we're seeing in the data that we've been collecting in surveys. People are often working close to home, but not necessarily at home when they're working remotely. And you can see that this has started to pick up some traction across a lot of different news publications over the last couple of years, referring to these third places. So you know, you can see places like Forbes and Axios talking about this, but also commercial real estate publications are focused on this, international organizations. So it's becoming quite a trend, but I really don't think people are talking about it enough. And what we see from our surveys is that actually, this is just a breakdown of total worked hours in the United States by the location where that work is happening. And so while, of course, a lot of work is still happening at places like employers' primary business premises, client work sites, and then at home, like we're often talking about, a lot of this work, the remote work side, is happening at places like coffee shops, libraries, co-working spaces that people are choosing to work at because maybe they don't have a supportive environment at home for remote work. Maybe they just need a change of scenery. And then you do see some anecdotes about how people are working with friends or with family to try to overcome some of the loneliness of just kind of sitting at home at your apartment all week while you're doing your work. So actually about a third of all remote work hours in the US right now is happening at places that are not the home. And because we have all this survey data, we can estimate the demand for working at third places across Greater Boston by neighborhood. But first, just to compare Boston to some other peer cities, this is a breakdown across all the cities in the US. This is a nationwide survey that we've been conducting since May 2020. You can see Boston is somewhere above the median in terms of the demand for working at these third places, but not quite as high as places like New York, Los Angeles, Miami that lead the country. And just breaking that down across Greater Boston here, we can see that oftentimes the demand for working at third places sort of tracks well with income. So places like Brookline, Cambridge, you're seeing a bit more demand for working at third places rather than in other neighborhoods around the area. So it's not evenly spatially distributed, but the range on that graph is actually not all that big. So it's going from about 16% to 22% of worked hours. And now we can take a look at the supply across Greater Boston of places where it might make sense to do this sort of work outside of the home. So if we just look at co-working spaces, this is using point of interest data from a company called SafeGraph that measures these things. We can see that co-working spaces, perhaps unsurprisingly, are really clustered in the downtown core, Back Bay, and Cambridge and Somerville. And actually, if we look at the distance from each census block group to the nearest co-working space, we can see that there's huge parts of the area that have no co-working spaces whatsoever. And actually just regressing the distance to the nearest co-working space with the income of that census block group, you can see that the higher income block groups are much more likely to be close to a co-working space. And this isn't a conspiracy, I don't think. It just generally makes good business sense probably to locate your co-working spaces somewhere where a lot of people are going to work and paying a lot of money to live. But if we add libraries, which is another potential third place, You can see that the spatial distribution is actually a lot more even. And actually, if you add libraries to this data set, you actually eliminate the income effect altogether. So there's no statistical relationship now between distance to access a third place and the income of the particular census block group. So in this case, this is one example of where the public sector has sort of stepped in to provide services across the area in a case where, and of course, this goes back before remote work really exploded in 2020, but across the area where the private sector was not necessarily doing that. And in the case of remote work, we're actually seeing this all around the country and around the world of the public sector now stepping in to say, hey, there's a lot of communities here that don't necessarily have suitable places for remote work to happen. And maybe the government can step in and create those spaces for people who might otherwise have to travel quite far or maybe can't afford a co-working space. Ireland, I think, in my research, has done the most to actually promote this. They built about 400 different remote working stations across the country. A lot of this is focused on kind of development in rural areas, but Maine also has a subsidy program. So co-working space developers can apply for funding in order to offset the cost of creating new co-working spaces. And then Canada, where I'm from, the federal government is actually operating their own co-working spaces for their own employees. So only federal employees are allowed to use them, but that just avoids having people to have to travel to downtown Ottawa or local regional centers in order to get to work. So my question as an engineer is that if we're going to be doing these sort of things, where should we actually place all of these shared workplaces? And as I mentioned, there's sort of a bunch of different goals, social goals that you could have when you're actually designing these algorithms to choose the optimal locations for shared workplaces. Just going back to one of the previous slides, you can see that there's a huge difference in access across neighborhoods, right? And I mentioned Cambridge and Somerville have some of the sort of lightest colors in this choropleth, so they have some of the best access. And if our goal was to give everybody in the area access, the same distance access as the average Cambridge and Somerville resident, you would have to build 237 new shared workplaces across the region. So doesn't seem entirely feasible to me, but that's one, kind of arbitrary goal. Another is we talk a lot in urban planning about 15-minute cities. So if you considered that a shared workplace would have to be a part of the bundle of services that are included in a 15-minute city, and we only use walking speed in this case, 91 new locations would be needed to give everybody in the Boston area, the towns that I chose to include here, access within 15 minutes walking to a shared workplace for them to do remote work. But if we talk about it, say, instead as a 30-minute city, maybe, we don't need to be as close to these shared workplaces because we're not visiting them quite as often. You would only need to build 12 new locations. So maybe a little bit more feasible. And then the last scenario that I looked at is the one where I was sort of talking about alternative goals, which is to say that if we had, say, funding for 10 different locations, where should we actually put them across the region? So the transportation engineer in me first started looking at minimizing the total travel distance for people to access these locations. And in this case, I'm just sort of arbitrarily not including libraries. So it makes the results a little bit more interesting, but also libraries aren't necessarily great for working in large groups anyways. So this is just looking at co-working spaces, keeping those where they are, and then saying we're going to build 10 new locations to serve people across the community. Where should we put them? So you can see, kind of makes sense. These stars end up in places where there really aren't existing community workspaces and sort of evenly distributed across the area. But there's other goals to just rather than minimizing distance. So one of the big impacts of remote work is that it's reduced the social interactions within our community, right? People aren't necessarily running into others when they're going into work. It kind of prevents this flow of ideas that people often talk about as sort of the economic driver of cities in general. So if we wanted to maximize total interactions, we can do some math that's going on behind the scenes here, and then place all of those 10 locations. And you'll notice that the actual locations are quite different than they were before. And mostly what's happening here is that they're being located in places where the population density is quite high and there's a lot of demand for these shared workplaces. And then lastly, another thing that some colleagues here at the Media Lab have really looked into is that remote work has caused a lot of segregation, social segregation as well. So one of the big drivers of people leaving their own neighborhood to interact with others from other communities was the work trip that was happening quite often. So what happens if we would actually design these types of shared community workplaces in order to minimize social segregation? And here I just took one example, which is income segregation. So it basically is looking at opportunities to have mixing between the lowest quartile and the highest quartile of the income across the metro area. And what I found quite interesting here was that actually in sort of the southern, I left the previous results on here as well, just made them gray. And you can see that down in the southern part of the region, the locations don't really change that much, maybe over by I don't know, half a mile or something like that. But actually in the northern part of the region, the locations have changed quite substantially from just maximizing social interactions to minimizing income segregation. So I don't actually have great insight into why that might be. This big difference between the south and the north of the metro area. But I'm also not from Boston, so I'm not as familiar with some of these communities. So if anybody has any insights into that, please do let me know. And so I'll just leave you with an open question, which is, what would you prioritize if you had the funding and you wanted to be able to create some of these new shared workplaces, which I really do think are in high demand across the region? Where would you put them, and what sort of goals would you use when you're deciding how to allocate that funding? And yeah, feel free to reach out to me after this if you have any questions. Thanks.
Okay, so we've got about another 5 or 7 minutes where we can have conversation or ask questions about that presentation. Thoughts, comments, concerns. If you all in the back want to come in, we've got seats up here. It's actually much better on this side of the glass. If you want to come. So there are some microphones floating around on each of the tables for anybody that wants to ask a question, make a comment, make an observation. Anybody want to dive in? Come on, the water's nice. Okay. They're all.
I think it's on.
Hi, Ben Cole. I work for Jobs for the Future. This is mostly just maybe a smaller data question. For prioritizing things like social interaction, where did you get that type of data?
In that case, we were just looking at what the demand is for these third places, which I showed on an earlier slide, and then figuring out, how many people could we expect to go to each location depending on where we built it, and then trying to maximize the number of people that would go to each location to interact with one another.
Gotcha. Thanks.
And we make some broad assumptions, like people aren't going to travel more than 3/4 of a mile or so in order to actually access one of these locations. They probably just stay at home. So in that case, that's why they generally end up in places of high population density. It sort of attracts the widest range of people.
So another hand there, somebody that wanted to.
So I had a question. Did you, in terms of what would you prioritize, did you at any point aggregate all the different maps that you made to see if there were any sort of commonalities between all of your different variables, to see if there was one particular point on the map where, oh, this would check off every single box that I'm looking at? Did you ever think of doing that?
I have thought about doing it. Yeah, I didn't do it for this particular case study yet, but that's one really smart approach to solving this problem, is not just to consider each of the objectives in isolation, but maybe consider them all with sort of varying amounts of weights, depending on what your objectives are. But if you wanted to equally say weight all 3 of those objectives that I showed you, or some other ones, I suspect you would find some sort of locations that are close to optimal for all of the different locations. Yeah, great suggestion.
Another question? Comment?
I'm Ahmed Yassin. I work for the Center for Health Analytics and Investigation. And I was curious about more of the methods in deciding how social interactions work. I was wondering if you could explain a bit more about that.
Sure. Yeah, we took a pretty naive approach, which is just to say, I guess we could frame it more as opportunities for social interactions rather than social interactions. So we just wanted to basically put as many people in one place as we could and assume that social interactions will follow from there. But we didn't make any assumptions on what kinds of people are more likely to interact with each other or not. And of course, the sort of economic development side of social interactions really depends on the combinations of people who are actually doing those interactions. Ideally, that's why you see this sort of clustering of, say, the tech industry in San Francisco, is because there's a lot of people who can have conversations on similar topics. So interactions between people with completely different industries or occupations might not be as useful as people who work in the same industry. But we just assume that any opportunity for social interactions would be treated equally in order to come up with those maps.
Any other comments, questions about this presentation? Natalia, you want to provoke anybody?
You want me to start provoking already? I don't know if it's fair. Yeah. Well, let's go with the third one and then we'll. Okay.
Third presentation. Restaurant recovery?
Yes. All right. So as in the introduction, I said, like, my name is Mohsen. I'm working in MIT Connection Science and Human Dynamics groups in Media Lab and IDSS. I am going to talk about our work jointly with Amir, my co-author, and also Alex Pentland. In our group, as I said, we do mostly computational social science, and it means that we want to use data with the ultimate aim of empowering communities. So here, this study is about understanding the factors which are associated with restaurant food traffic recovery in post-pandemic. So why restaurants and why food traffic? So restaurants and food industries constitute a large proportion of the economic activity in most economies. So they are very important entities in economic activity. Also, as employment, based on the estimates with Bureau of Labor Statistics, about like 12 million people were hired in the US in 2019 in restaurant industry. And the maximum share among them were belonging to waiters and waitresses with 20.7%. So this shows the importance of them also, like in employment. And the physical space which restaurants provide are very fundamental for social interactions. And we know that the social interactions are very helpful to societies flourish and also revive. So all these together, when the COVID-19 happened, because of the all these COVID prevention measures, most of the restaurants and most of the businesses had to close. So they faced challenging situations. Many of them were permanently closed. Many people were left unemployed. So altogether, this we are going to understand restaurants, how actually they recovered after the pandemic. So here, what we focus on is the information about the restaurant's customers. So there is another work in our group by Takayabe and Esteban. So they focus on the location and dependency, physical location dependency of the businesses on each other on recovery. But here we mainly focus on the customer information. So what data sets we use? So we use business places information, which provides category and also detailed information like location, square footage, and other information about the locations we study. We also have this weekly visit patterns from SafeGraph, which counts how many visits to each restaurant happened weekly, and also from which census block group in the geography of a study. And what happens, we collected data from Yelp.com. Actually, we collected this in 2020. And Yelp.com is, this business directory which has information about businesses, and people can go there and review and rate them. So they have this, Yelp.com had this general information about the businesses, like what is the business name, where is it, where the address is, what are the open days, what are the category tags, etc. But after restaurants reopening, they added more information, and it was about their COVID prevention strategies they adopt. And then, for example, they had like mask mandates. You had like tick or like cross like this. So it is showing like if they impose mask mandates on their workers or not, sanitization, if they provide sanitizations, if they have reduced their capacity to reduce the COVID risk and also the social distancing, etc. So we collected all these data from the Yelp.com, and of course we have data about census block groups from census, and that is mainly what we use here is their median household income and education level. So we have definitions. The first definition is pre-pandemic period. We take all year 2019 as 1 year as pre-pandemic, and then we have recovery. Recovery actually starts from July 2020, when the restaurants were allowed to reopen for the dining services. And we have a definition for that, which is recovery index. Recovery index is the average visits in the recovery period weekly divided by the average pre-pandemic. So it means that what percentage of customers they could bring back to their physical space. And the geography of study are Boston metro statistical area and also New York City. We consider the restaurants which have foot traffic records from 2018 until the end of recovery period. So why 2018? Because we thought restaurants that had been working and were operational during 2018, they had enough time to reach their capacity of the customers. And so we don't study the permanently closed restaurants because we want to understand the recovery. So we have 927 places in Boston and also 4,000 places in New York City, mainly concentrated in the Manhattan area. And so after intersecting with Yelp data, we have 968 restaurants in New York City. So looking at the recovery ratio, we see both in Boston area and also in NYC area, restaurants actually didn't do that great. So the median is about like half. So in the year after the pandemic and after they were allowed to reopen, they could bring mainly half of the customers. But yeah, there are restaurants, some of them are outliers, but mainly they are half and you know. So our regression models, this is the only equation here. So that yeah, so here we look at the recovery index and then try to understand what are the factors associated there. So first factor, which was important for us, was the diversity of the customers. And we measured that with the entropy metric, because usually most of the studies have shown that the diversity can help, you know, if you have like diverse interactions, if you have from diverse groups of friends, and also the business places who had diverse customers or diverse visited, they could do better in general. So we take the diversity, and then we have other metrics like mean income of the customers, mean education level of the customers, and we control for other factors like number of the places the people come visit there, category of the restaurant, and information from Yelp, including price level, star rating, social distancing, and all. So altogether, what our results show? So when we do this analysis, the main important finding is that actually it was counterintuitive for us that customer diversity actually had negative association with their recovery, and it was significant in this analysis, and it was the same in both New York City and Boston area. But of course, intuitive parts that show customer mean income help the restaurants in their recovery. I mean, they were who had higher customer mean income, they were more likely to recover faster, and also mean education level, which is negatively associated. Probably the reason is people could work from home and then didn't visit that place. So adding Yelp data, what important finding we have there from all the factors we added from the Yelp, what was interesting and that could show a positive association with the recovery and was significant is mask mandates. So people were more likely to go to the restaurants which had mask mandates on their workers, and they had to, wear masks during the services. So altogether, we studied restaurant recovery and then controlling for all these factors. We showed that how restaurants, what were the factors restaurants associated with restaurants recovery. It was important to know that the diversity of customers had negative association with their recovery, which was counterintuitive. And then people were trying to go to the places with the lower risk. So because of that, maybe they chose the places with mask mandates. And yes, we hope that the results of this study can help the restaurant business and people in this business to get help from these results and do some different, let's say, marketing decisions or adopt marketing strategies that can help them in future exogenous shocks like the pandemic. Yeah, thank you.
We could take about 5 minutes or so for comments and questions about this particular presentation. In the back there's a microphone on that back table somewhere, if someone would get it to you.
Hi, I'm Ronak Basu. I'm a postdoc in the Department of Urban Studies and Planning here at MIT. Thanks for your presentation. A couple of questions, would love to hear your thoughts, questions/comments, I guess. The first one is about your measure of restaurant recovery index. So if I remember correctly, you were looking at the ratio of the number of visits to a restaurant and using that as like, how has that changed over time? Has it gone back to pre-pandemic levels in 2019, right? But since the pandemic, there's been such a huge upsurge of food delivery apps and online ordering, and a restaurant that has fewer visits may not necessarily be doing worse because a lot of their usual customer base might have shifted to online ordering. So love to hear your thoughts on that. And the second comment I had was, I think with SafeGraph data and similar data sources, the unit of analysis is a census block group. It's not a person who's visiting. So when we take data that describes the census block group on average or as a median, so we know the median income, for example, but that's the median, right? So there could be households living in that block group with very different incomes compared to the median. So we don't know who's actually visiting the restaurant. So that kind of like, I'm struggling to reconcile how one might relate the characteristics of a block group with the characteristics of a person who actually went and visited the restaurant. Thank you.
Yes, sure. So about the first one, as I explained, we don't measure sales here. So we don't talk about sales. Some restaurants may have completely removed their physical space and just like do delivery or takeouts. But here, why foot traffic is important for us, because that restaurants who keep their physical space, they pay rent for it. So they want to utilize it first. And then second is, which is more important than that, and that is the social interaction. So we provide social interactions, and as more people we can attract to the restaurants, we can facilitate more face-to-face, discussions and probably more interactions between them and more probability of sharing opportunities. So that is why we look at the foot traffic, not sales. So of course, like there is sales data, but that is not our, focus of the study here, because of mainly the social interactions, not the restaurants itself, revenue or sales. So this is the first one. And for the second one, the census block groups are about like 10 blocks of the size. So yes, they are not like individual level, but they're not that much different, because 10 blocks next to each other, you won't see that much, differences in their, for example, like hygiene index in their, income level. And also what we do here, we have the weighted mean median income actually. So it is weighted mean of that median income. And so that is what we can do. That is the most granular data we have. We actually turned this also like into more aggregate level to the census tract and analyzed that. That was also like the same results. But yeah, I cannot say anything about individuals. But that was the best, I mean, most granular analysis we could do with our data.
Hi, thanks for your presentation. My name's Ethan. I work in the research division of the Boston Planning and Development Agency. We're doing a lot of similar work and looking at similar data. My question was, with your measure of restaurant customer diversity, that's geographic diversity. So, you know, one restaurant has low geographic diversity. It's mostly customers from 1 or 2 block groups. Another restaurant, it's people coming from a bunch of different block groups. Is it possible that the effect that you measured has to do with some restaurants are located in central business districts where lots of people commute, and then after the pandemic with remote and hybrid work, there's fewer people commuting in, and so they suffered more than a main street business that has more local sort of business traffic? Did you look at, like, is the geographically diverse restaurants, are they clustered in sort of central job areas?
Yeah, so very great question. One of the things is in our model, we actually control for the number of the blocks. So if both of them have this, both restaurants have the same number of blocks, that you can compare the, the diversity. But other than that, as I mentioned in the first slide, we have another work in our group. Actually, Taka is there. You can ask from him at the end. They study this question, the second question you ask, and this is dependency of the, like businesses on the other businesses around them. So, you can see, yes, for example, maybe, what's that? Starbucks next to MIT is highly dependent on MIT. And if MIT is closed, then that Starbucks is more likely to lose most of the customers. But here, we wanted to, other than that, provide insights on the customers. So if I am even in a, let's say, low foot traffic area or high foot traffic area, maybe that can help me to understand if I'm doing good. So, I mean, in general, what I get from this study is instead of getting uniform customers from everywhere, it might be better to, yes, get customers from more block, but at least like a couple of them be loyal customers to you. So in such cases, you won't lose those loyal customers.
Any other questions or comments about this specific presentation? All right, so I think we can move into a broader discussion about the 3 presentations and how they relate to the other or how they don't. And that will be led by our friend Natalia.
All right. So I may be one of the few people in this region that has worked in the restaurants, summer works, youth employment, and in the planning space, but specifically around. Now they know how they fit together. It's me. We can go. No, but so as I'm thinking about all of this, I'm going to go to a totally different space where I think the connection between the 3 really are. And that connection to me is about quality of life, right? Individuals choose cities because they believe that that's the best place for them, for their growth, for whether it's economic opportunity, whether it's educational opportunity. And as I was thinking about all 3 of these presentations, we want vibrant, thriving cities. We want safe cities. We want educated cities. We want cities where it's fun to go out to eat, where we can, easily access workspaces if our home, either bores us or it doesn't provide what we need. And so I thought that thread was really woven nicely across the 3. The second piece that I thought was really important is about how important social interactions really are across these three spaces for youth when they go to work. The outcomes when young people were working virtually, I assume were really different than when they were in person with their mentors. Alicia, do you have any comments on that?
Yeah, they actually were not. They were very surprised. That's really sad. So we actually analyze, of course, because that's what we do as researchers. So when the city pivoted to their Learn and Earn program, for example, we randomly assigned young people to participate into their courses, and we followed them over time. We also followed the young people in the virtual internship program. And there's a real concern that during that summer, would young people want virtual things after a spring of not great virtual school, where like 1 in 20 kids was not even logging in at BPS? And it turned out that these kinds of jobs were actually just as impactful as having an in-person job. And in some ways they were better because they were better aligned with the career interests that the young people wanted. So instead of like showing up and doing the camp counselor job or whatever, these were kids who were doing like writing a marketing plan for a company, right? They were helping to put together a COVID-19 public health campaign and get the word out to their peers. And so except for certain things like, so there was some sanity check where we asked them on the survey things like, how improvements in like making eye contact and stuff like that. That does not improve over Zoom. Right. But that was sort of like our gut check of like, oh, this data is actually real. They're not telling us just what we want to hear. But they were more likely to have a mentor who told them about different career interests, help them pursue a post-secondary education track. And they got a lot of the same skills, like even, the soft skills, like managing your emotions, resolving conflicts with a peer, asking for help. That all still happens over Zoom. So it's kind of surprising.
Thank you. So and I'll go back to kind of the social interaction, because even in that space, there was social interaction, right? That mentorship, that key alignment around how do we as individuals connect with other individuals in order to have kind of this high quality of life, get access to opportunities. I do have some kind of questions just, that I'll throw to each of the three, and whoever wants to answer, go ahead and answer. Because I think one of the pieces that's really important in these types of topics is to talk about how, in fact, we take this research to that next level. So research happens. And then what, right? What happens after we learn what we learn, and where's the opportunity for that next level of research? Particularly, maybe I'll start with you, Mohsen, because the research that you did about and what you learned about restaurants then, right, during the pandemic, and just, up until the kind of the end of the recovery of the pandemic, obviously we're still in it, but restaurants have really seen lots of shifts in how they operate today versus how they operated in 2021 even. And so I'd love for you to talk a little bit about, what happens after this research, and why is this research really important?
Yeah, so getting back to the point of social interaction. So we know that restaurants are very fundamental for social interaction. So otherwise, like we could close the restaurants at all and then order or like buy something, grab something and eat. But other than that, there are two strategies our group follows. One of them is sponsoring, or let's say hosting this events like this BARI, so we can get connected to the people who are actually doing the work, and maybe we can interact. That is social interaction again. If we don't have this and we just like do Zoom, I don't think like the experience shows we could benefit. But here we have this social interaction. We talk to each other, like people from government, people from academia, people from businesses. That is one way to bring our research results to the action. And the second is we also try to build up the platforms, different platforms. So for example, we have like Atlas of Inequality, Atlas of Opportunity, and what we try to do is that we try to translate our research findings from academic language to, let's say map-based interactive, websites. So every group of people, I mean, any group of people, let's say people who do businesses or work in companies, people who are looking for good future for their neighborhood, or government people can go to those websites, use the tools which are built off of our, studies, and that is how we want to reach, to our, let's say, main audience or target audience.
Thank you. Do you guys want to add anything?
Yeah, I would just add two things. One, I think the goal of our research project, one, it's to implement the recommendations, right, that's coming out of this partnership with Northeastern University. So there's definitely a clear strategy of how we need to do that. And then in addition to that, we need to think about building the capacity, internal capacity within our team to make sure that we can continue to analyze and assess and evaluate this work as well. So I would say that. And then the quick third thing there is, and we've talked about this a number of times, is how do we share the research like on the ground level with our employers, with those folks who are doing the work, so that they can be informed of what's needed to be able to improve their work as well. So thinking about a strategy to be able to do that also.
I just wanted to quickly add to that, that institutional challenge grant is not just to support the partnership that we've had for a long time, but to build that capacity, not just in the city, but also build the capacity to do this kind of research within the university, right? And so that's where that city to city initiative that I was talking about, that's what it's doing inside Northeastern, is to provide faculty with the training, the coaching, the mentoring to be able to form these research practice partnerships, because we didn't just get data, go away for a year and then come back and present it to the city. We meet every 2 weeks. We talk through what are the research questions that the city needs to have answered, right? My first research questions were around, is this thing impactful, right? So we did do that. But the second set of research questions is this program operating in the way that we think it is, or the way we think it should? And we co-created that research agenda together. And then we talked about how are we going to collect the data, right? In terms of not just the data we could pull from their system, but also the surveys that we run with young people, the kinds of questions that you ask people. It's important to know like their positionality as well as your own, right? And then finally, how do you interpret those, the data that you're getting in the findings, right? So a lot of times we bring to Rashad's team, hey, did you see this? Look at this trend. They'd be like, yeah, well, that's because this employer dropped out that year, or we changed the way we assign jobs, right? As an academic, you can get this so very wrong if you are not talking to the people who are on the ground and doing this lived experience day in and day out. And then even how you interpret those findings, right? Like nobody wants to hear that there were jobs that were, not filled with young people at the end of this matching process, right? But at the same time, like when you uncover the why, you're like, oh, it's so obvious. Like if young people only applying to one job and like 350 of them apply to the same job, that's like, 320 are unemployed right off the bat, right? But the way you interpret is super important. And the last thing I'll say is when you form that kind of partnership, then that's how research evidence gets used, right? Because if we just come out of nowhere as academics with data and information and, you haven't had a partner who's helping you interpret that or have skin in the game, right? Then it's really hard for them to wrap their heads around it and want to use it, right? But, Rashad has been a partner all the way along and has contributed to this process. And so he can trust, right, the findings that we're bringing to him because he knows where they're coming from.
Yeah, so as I mentioned when I was going through my presentation, this is very early stage research. You folks are actually pretty much the first people to ever see those results. I just showed it to my advisor yesterday, actually. But we are working through, one thing that my group does really well at MIT, I think, is that we really focus on who the stakeholders are for our research. So I mentioned that at the beginning, we work a lot with transit agencies. This doesn't necessarily apply to transit agencies specifically, although I would argue that, building some of these remote work hubs at transit hubs might be really helpful for transit agency ridership. But we kind of stepped back and thought about, do we have any connections to people who might actually be interested in this research? And so recently we found out that the Urban Land Authority in Singapore is actually trying to sponsor some of these shared workspaces across the country there. And so we've become connected with them, hoping to share our results with them and perhaps use this to inform sort of smart location decisions rather than some of these more just scattershot decisions that have been made by other jurisdictions who have tried to implement this in the past. So it is definitely something that we're thinking about, but sort of a little early to start actually sharing it at this stage.
I have so many follow-up questions for all the projects, but I'm not going to go there. I'm going to ask another question all around because everything is a funding issue, right? The reason we can't have what we need in our societies is because there's not enough capacity and not enough money. So I'm going to ask the question, if funding was not an issue, do you believe that you could just resolve all of the issues that you're presenting in your research? We'll start over here.
Sure. So I'm going to say no. And the reason is the one extension of this research that I was really hoping to do once I'm done with sort of the mathematical modeling is actually looking at whether zoning is preventing this from happening at all. So my hypothesis is probably that it is. There's a lot of places that are only zoned for residential uses where it would be impossible to actually build a remote work hub somewhere. So I think there are also sort of regulatory and land use challenges in addition to funding that would come into play here.
And luckily the BPDA is here and the zoning issues, particularly in Boston, are, a great example of how, it's not just funding, it's not just capacity. There are some underlying issues that really impact our communities regardless of kind of what we want to see come out of it. Turn it over to you guys.
I would say funding could really address probably about 70% of the challenges that we see within the youth jobs program. One of the things that we feel will be truly instrumental is investing in a youth jobs infrastructure, that could essentially serve as a single entry point for any employer that is connecting and employing young people. Because the application process is managed by each individual ecosystem partner. And then with our grant process, as Alicia mentioned, now each of our nonprofit partners are also managing their own application process, right? So that does make it really complicated for young people and families, that are trying to navigate how to apply to jobs, and if they're, if they don't get into this type of job, where do they stand with another employer, that has a different application. So an infrastructure that can be a centralized entry point for young people is something that, we're hoping we can continue to have conversation around. It can gain some traction and find some funding for it. And then attaching like a learning management system to that infrastructure as well, so that, within that young people can track the skills that they're learning through these jobs, that can help form an electronic portfolio, right, that they can use that's transferable to employers as well. So funding can help out with a little bit of that.
Yes, so usually my research is focused on providing insights for decision makers so they can make informed decisions. So it's like either like they're like people in different communities or let's say government people or business owners. So we just provide insight and say like, hey, if you continue like this, or if you are doing this, this is likely to happen. Now decision is yours. So it is not dependent on funding, but for example, like, okay, your neighborhood is not healthy. Why? Maybe you don't have access to gym. And that is not, that is the people should demand the government, and then government should respond them. So I cannot say like if that would help with everything, but not related to my research. Funding can help most of the problems.
So we're about to wrap up. So I have to talk about the private sector, right? Because one, I'm representing Eastern Bank Foundation, and two, small businesses make up 80% of the economy. So employers with less than 50 employees, but particularly less than 5 employees are the majority, is the biggest bulk of our employment. And I see a lot of restaurants in that space. I am thinking about the market solution to the co-working space, right? I'm wondering if coffee shops and other, small spaces that could be converted into, third spaces. So if a restaurant only opens at 5 during the day, could it open as a co-working space? What does that look like? And then thinking about specifically for, placement for youth, how do you engage with young people as a small business owner in your main streets to ensure that, that there are enough jobs, that they're local, that they're, continuing to be run and the engine behind them to be local young people. And so my question to all of you to kind of close out this panel is, what is your ask of the business community and how can you engage them in your work?
So I think like I found the right person. So so most of my studies are highly related to small businesses. So yeah, maybe through connections like you, we can get connected to the small businesses. But on the other hand, as I said, like we are developing tools and insights for small business owners so they can use those tools online for free and then have more information while they want to make decisions. So this is how we are going to support them. I mean, let's say, and then we also like small businesses to trust academia, and yeah, which is a little bit difficult.
One of the recommendations we didn't touch on, because this is pretty lengthy report and there's lots of recommendations in there, but one of them is aligning the jobs in the summer youth employment program more with the sectors that are in high demand across the city. So some of this happens, right? There are some jobs that are in healthcare and some that are in the life sciences, but not as many as those that are like in the daycare, the day camp, the nonprofit sector. And so that's something that takes a partnership with the private sector, right? To be able to bring those jobs, not even into the program, but even back into the program, because a lot of those jobs were there before the pandemic, right? And then when the pandemic had really disrupted a lot of those kinds of opportunities. And I guess I would say a sector that we're trying to bring into the summer youth employment program this year is the 4-year higher ed institution, right? So Mayor Wu has set a really ambitious goal of employing 1,000 additional young youth this summer. And coming up with those additional slots is not easy. So Northeastern's actually leading a sector of higher ed institutions, including BU, BC, Tufts, UMass, Harvard, to employ young people this summer. So at Northeastern, we're bringing 125 young people on campus to employ them and expose them to a 4-year college campus. And if any of you want to ask MIT to please come along with us, that'd be great. Or think about it for next year, because, this is certainly a place where we think that there's a gap, right, between what happens, in the ecosystem here in Boston, between the opportunities that young people have for work and what they have for post-secondary opportunities.
Yeah, you mentioned the restaurants opening early for people who want to do remote work. And actually the restaurant Shybird here in Kendall Square, you can buy this sort of like remote work day pass thing where you can hang out there all day and you get like a discount on your food and drinks. So we're starting to see that happen a little bit. But what I would ask of the private business community is to start thinking about investing in underinvested communities for these remote workspaces, right? I showed the map where all the co-working spaces are today, and that doesn't give a lot of great access to people in underserved communities. So I think that that's something that the private sector could take some leadership on. I think they might be surprised at how much demand there is even in underserved communities for these remote workspaces. So that's probably where I would go with that question.
Thank you. Well, I thank you all for your research, for presenting it to us today. Lou, thank you for your leadership today and always. And thank you all for listening to us. We'll stick around a few minutes if there are additional questions and anyone wants to hang out or whatever. Good to see you guys and enjoy the rest of the conference.
Yeah, totally. And then what you see in like the framework now is that they have all access now, so you don't even want to commit to like a specific application, you can just have the path and go where you want, you know, city. But yeah, I think again, it's just something there to cover some workers and there's a lot of you know, like for the transit versus. Yeah, so there's a lot of creative stuff that you can do with this. So, and I'm, I think that is what I think. We're also not going to we have like
Right. I know. That's me. It's the cool room. And then this is the big room. Yeah. Which I'm sort of interesting that they categorize it here. I was kind of doing part of the ability and environmental equality. It was one part. The project is more about how we are capturing and how we How's everything else? Sorry, God.
You. Doing most of the work. I'm just here to answer any questions. I think he's ready. I have a very easy job, just kind of hanging out. The thing is, the questions and what, because I'm gonna know more of the answer than he is. Because he knows all the data and all that stuff. When it comes to the specific stuff, it's like I'm the one that's done that. Depends on the questions. Don't ask any hard questions. No, I love hard questions. That's the hard question. We're in the same spot.
So they want to like describe that as a shot and then the saw a shot. It's like, oh, I'm Amy. Nice to meet you. I feel like the pleasure. So I missed the talk, so I'm like, gosh. This is Matt, who's a partner. Formally now, so I was like, I love it. I'm looking forward to.
Yeah, same. I was really impressed by how visual your presentation was, which is not the exact opposite, but I would say 70% the opposite of my presentation. The bureaucrat's trap, honestly.
Well, I have a little bit of freedom,
Yeah.
because I'm not connected to the city.
Yeah.
So I can fly a little bit far now. I totally understand.
Sometimes it's also hard to visualize data. I saw it's like your thing, it's like facts, data, and it's what it is.
I mean, this presentation, I did avoid to do data. Yeah, I'm more focused to the presentation.
Yeah.
The distribution part. I do have the data in the computer, but I don't know. It's having data. That's wonderful. I feel like that's really awful.
I haven't seen your deck, I was going on. I assume it's data.
So yeah, so I do have the data in Tableau, but if we're running from one computer, I can definitely not.
Yeah.
So I don't know, I want to have this interactivity, but I just. It's okay.
Yeah, I'm sure it's gonna be great.
I'm happy to stay. Like a lot of the other rooms that have table, it's happy to be a
You
table.
know, that's what I'm saying. That's what I'm saying. You're the cool guys.
So I saw one of the rooms upstairs, and I was like, how do you even do that? Actually, that I was, you were in the innovation.
Yeah.
They had like people, stuff like that, they were all. And I mean, it worked. I don't know if it worked. They actually look at that.
Yeah, I mean, it's like.
In this case, absolutely.
I missed that. That's the one deal with. Which you the program. Very hard. Perfect. Yeah, no, she was like, you don't have it. And why you don't have it.
Steven's a good person now.
Yeah. No, what happened is you're. I was like,
I've like seen stuff like this, it's like, I want to be.
You should.
It looks like fun.
You should, okay, well, one that's carefully. Should absolutely. We're a gentle human saying, like, the provocative things are like his perspective. No,
it was.
How was that?
I'm very. So I feel like. I'm very excited.
I learned today that the person that designed the pictures is also.
Oh, really? They're taking over slowly. It's slowly and quiet. Yeah, that's what I'm nervous. I was like, geez. Perfect. More excited.
This is Colin. Oh, hey, Colin, you haven't met me. I don't see you in person. I'm Will Becker. Oh, okay. So good to see you. I've been on there.
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. So the well, like. I've been many times on Zoom.
Yeah.
Yes.
We were basically had, regional application. Josh. Could you tell any difference?
Next time, I'll expect you to ask hard questions. I'm very good at admitting.
Have you been to
And Will did make the wise choice of asking. We should mention the slides, and you weren't included. Yeah. So when I saw you, I said, well, so you know, like, what we put in the car. Only polite. About collaboration. Not make sense not to look at It's, you were finally moving.
Actually, we had.
Start,
Wings money where.
Oh, yeah, yeah. So we have him embedded with them, so we have access. I'm glad I did such a. Like, we need this experience, so we don't want anything, I don't want any excuses on our side.
And I never met Marvel.
Yeah. It's like. I'm like, I'm gonna keep brushing on the side. Yes. I think we can. The faster we do this, the faster we get set up, the faster we get the faster we can make pitch for the next. I can't do the next thing. Oh, I missed it. How was it?
Yeah, so, I have.
Yeah.
I jumped on
I wonder if that's research as we go forward. I think it's the, for instance, like, we're actually returning family. And as the old.
Right there.
I'm excited. Very. Like I. So it was, well, we made a review and then I get the price off. The class here, the class here.
Ready, yeah, the last session, the talking tour waited until he did the presentation. But
Another one.
yeah. No, sorry.
Think about how you're gonna propagate this. So great.
Access. We're supposed to. We have a circle, it's right there.
Yes.
Right near the green marble.
Oh, right.
Green's over here.
No, the clicker.
Right now.
Yeah. We're being trying to. No, no, even though. It's okay. No, we are.
Sounds like. Looking to the right, they kind of. Yes.
There's a big word, I think it's three or four. And I feel better about it. It's not about.
Students have to read documents, like scientists, some of those things, I think that's like.
All right, let's get started. Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us. My name is Santiago Garces. I am the Chief Information Officer for the City of Boston. And I'll just frame a little bit our conversation. Digital equity is something that I care about deeply, that our mayor, Michelle Wu, cares about deeply, because we know that connectivity is such a precursor to participating meaningfully in so many things. Getting access to knowledge, getting access to job opportunities, being able to connect with loved ones that are far away. And, like with at the city, we've been working for a long time in being able to make sure that everybody has access to connectivity, to devices, and to skills. And the pandemic, I think there's the framing. The pandemic really showed how critical these services that we had, and how terribly impactful the lack of the access to those that did not have access to affordable, high quality connectivity. So we have an amazing panel of people that have been doing really interesting things in this area. Marvin will be our provocateur, so he will have an opportunity to respond to each panelist and ask some pointed questions, and then we'll open it up for discussion. And I just before we start, I'll tell you a little bit about like what are some of the things, particularly in a research conference like this. In government, we have limited resources to deploy to solve different problems, right? And we know that particularly digital equity is one area that is so complex, where there's all these correlations between the perception of value versus the likelihood that someone's going to actually get connected, affordability. It's a very complex issue. So I'm very keen to get out of the conversation to start thinking about how is it that these experiences start helping us unentangle where the gaps are, to unentangle where is the best value per dollar, per public dollar invested. Think about public policy perspective, and then see how is it that we move forward. But I'll let each person introduce themselves a little bit briefly, just their title, their organization. Then we'll start with Will, and then Marvin can respond.
Very quickly, Marvin Vinay, Chief Advocacy Officer at Tech Goes Home. Good to see all of you here.
Thanks, Marvin. I'm Will Pfeffer. I am the Civic Technologist at the Metropolitan Area Planning Council, or MAPC.
I am Lina Maria Giraldo. I'm an assistant professor from Emerson College in the journalism department.
Hi, I'm Amy Mahler. I'm the Applied Policy Fellow with the Mayor's Office of New Mechanics in the City of Boston.
And I'm Matt Frank. I'm the Supportive Services Manager and Special Projects Coordinator at the Chelsea Housing Authority.
All right, so maybe we can pull up my presentation there. Is there a way to present it so this clicker will actually work on a PDF? Perhaps this will work. Hopefully this will work.
So as I said, I'm Will. I'm from the Metropolitan Area Planning Council. We are the regional planning agency that serves the 101 cities and towns that make up Greater Boston. Matt Frank has been a partner to me on this project, so he's here as well. I'll cover the presentation, and then we'll both participate in the discussion afterwards. So as you all know, hopefully, we are here today to talk about digital equity. Probably not the first time you've heard this, and it certainly won't be the last time you hear this afternoon, but we think about digital equity as being made up of three key components. Those components being digital literacy, broadband access, and device access. They're all important, and none of them really matter without the other two. My talk today will focus primarily on broadband access, but we will touch on the other two as well. So I'm going to start by talking about digital equity planning, and then I'll move into some work that we've done to implement some of the recommendations that we've made in this plan. So MAPC received some federal funding through the Economic Development Administration back in 2020 and 2021 to do some planning work with the cities of Chelsea, Everett, and Revere. We did this as a regional plan, working with these three communities that share borders and share a fair number of similar demographic characteristics, although they are all distinct in some ways as well. The planning process included both community engagement as well as analysis of administrative data from sources like the American Community Survey and a bunch of others. The bar charts you're looking at here for any ACS heads are from ACS table 2801. which relates to computer and internet use. On the top, you're looking at the proportion of residents or of households, excuse me, without access to a computer. And the bottom is households without access to an internet connection. Chelsea, Everett, and Revere are the bars in yellow, and the red bar is the Commonwealth as a whole. So you can see that there's a higher proportion than the Commonwealth as a whole in these three communities that lack those basic, that basic access. So this next slide is kind of a fun one, I think. This is a map that we made using some proprietary ISP data. So ISPs or internet service providers do not generally publish the maps of where their fiber infrastructure is, but thanks to the cable franchise agreements that these ISPs hold with the city governments are able to request copies of those maps that aren't normally available to the public. What we did here, or I should say what my colleague Lex Berman did, was to match those static PDF maps of where the infrastructure is against a base map. He then compared the locations of fiber infrastructure to census blocks and did some calculations to determine what percentage of addresses within a given census block fell within 200 feet of a mapped fiber line. We selected 200 feet because this is sort of the maximum distance over which you can run a traditional copper cable before you start to see some quality, the quality decrease over what's being provided by the fiber infrastructure. A couple of notes on the map here before we move on are that this map doesn't tell us anything about actual connections. This is just about existing infrastructure. It's showing a best case scenario or sort of a ceiling of what service could look like without putting additional fiber in the ground. And it also doesn't tell us anything about cost, which is a really, really big factor in people's access to the internet, especially in a more dense area like Greater Boston. So finally, I mentioned that there was a pretty significant community engagement component to this planning process. This photo is sort of representative of that. That community engagement process looked like going to community events like this. This is a community movie night at the Prattville Apartments, which is a Chelsea Housing Authority property, which will be sort of the focus of the second half of what I'll be talking about today. But we also did survey outreach, individual, like one-on-one interviews, and focus groups. All right, so just to wrap up on planning, I wanted to share a couple of the key recommendations that we made in this plan. This isn't all of them, but I think it's a pretty good selection of the type of actions that we're suggesting that the cities take. Those actions include doing municipal broadband planning, which is distinct from digital equity planning in that broadband planning involves planning for locations of physical infrastructure, whereas digital equity planning is concerned with the human outcomes. Let's see, I'm losing my place here. We also, the broadband planning is actually something that these three cities have done since the publication of this plan, or since we started working on this plan. And it's also something that other communities, including the city of Boston, have done fairly recently. It's essentially an in-depth look at the cost and feasibility of building something like a municipally owned fiber network. Other recommendations here are to hire a digital equity officer, build digital navigator programs that could sit in schools, libraries, or community centers and provide training for residents, dig once policies, which would require that fiber lines be installed anytime a street is dug up for utility work, open access networks in which a city would own the physical fiber and then lease access to providers, and finally, apartment Wi-Fi, which is sort of what we're here to talk about today. All right, so we're back at the Prattville Apartments in Chelsea, which is a Chelsea Housing Authority property with 128 units of family housing. It's actually one of two sites at Prattville. This one is called the Brickies, and there's another part of the campus that has wood-framed buildings called the Woodies. This is one of the sites where we've been working on this apartment Wi-Fi project. So MAPC is a planning agency first and foremost, but one of the other things that we're really good at is helping cities and towns buy stuff. And so that's what we're going to do here. The idea behind apartment Wi-Fi is essentially that we can use available federal funding to provide access to the internet in a super direct way to folks that really need it. Essentially, we use ARPA funding through the Mass Broadband Institute to pay for the capital costs in the first year of expenses to build a high-speed network that everyone who lives in the building can access for free in their homes. We also we partner with housing agencies, partly because in order to be cost effective, this sort of solution requires some density. You have to be able to serve a bunch of people with one big network. And we also know that everyone who lives there meets the income requirements for this type of federal funding. The agreements that we have with our housing agency partners are that we cover all of the startup costs and we cover the first year of service. And then either the city or the housing authority takes on years 2 and 3 of the service. We do this in 3-year contracts because that's the maximum contract that the state will let us sign or that state law will let us sign. But the expectation is that this service will continue on after year 3 and will continue to be funded by either the city or the housing authority, depending on the context. All right, so we have the idea, we have the funding, we have willing partners, but how do we actually get this done? So it turns out that the procurement laws in Massachusetts are kind of complicated. And I'm told even more so than in other states. I'm sure this is a surprise to no one here. But I'll run through some of what we did and some of the learnings that we had here. This is federal funding, which comes with its own set of requirements. And then MAPC as an agency follows Chapter 30B, which is the same procurement requirement that municipalities have to follow when they buy things. So there's a few things we need to do before we even issue a procurement. The first of which is to sign an MOU with both the city and the housing authority. We also select a procurement pathway. So is this a request for quotes, a request for proposals, or an invitation for bids? These different pathways allow us to evaluate the different bids in different ways, whether that is by lowest cost, by best design, or a variety of other factors. But whatever we do, we need to clearly define it from the start. From there, we draft the specifications and the solicitation itself. And one thing that we've done to help with this is to do a wireless signal survey. So this is an example of the wireless signal survey that we did at Prattville. Our goal with these projects is to only install access points or routers in stairwells, hallways, and other sort of public spaces. Part of that is so that we can cover a lot of people with less hardware. And part of that is that it means that the housing authority doesn't have to enter people's homes if there's ever maintenance that needs to be done. So this makes it a lot simpler. The challenge, though, is that Wi-Fi signals don't always like to go through walls and still work well on the other side. And it's especially challenging at Prattville because this is a building made out of cinder blocks. So what we do is hire a vendor to go do a signal strength survey. They essentially put up basically a test access point in a hallway, go into an apartment and measure the signal strength. This helps them figure out where the best places to put the hardware is and what type of hardware is best to be used. Essentially, we're measuring, or we actually use this as one of the performance requirements in the contract. So we require that the vendors produce a signal strength inside apartments of at least -60 dBm, which is decibels per milliwatt. We find that signal strength is a much more enforceable and a much more consistent measurement than just doing like internet speed tests on a laptop. There's a lot of other ways that those can get sort of screwed up or affected by outside factors. All right. So once we issue the solicitation, there's a fair amount of vendor engagement that needs to happen to ensure that we get good competitive bids. This usually starts with an optional Zoom call where we basically just explain the project and take verbal questions. There's a mandatory site visit, which is followed by a period for bidders to submit written questions. And then oftentimes those questions and input that we get from the vendors leads us to issue amendments or addenda to the actual solicitations so that we make sure that we're asking for something that makes sense from the actual technical experts. These are just a couple of photos from some of our site visits. This is just a sort of a fun personal perk of this kind of work that it allows me to have the opportunity occasionally to do things like go up on a roof or in a utility room where you're not normally allowed to go. So that's always fun for me. Okay. It's the little things. I love to go on a roof. So that's why I brought you along. All right. So once the solicitation deadline passes and we've received bids, the next step is to evaluate them. As I said before, how we do this is defined by the procurement pathway that we use, but there's a couple of things to call out here. First is that it's really important to engage local stakeholders in this process because ultimately we are buying something that they will have to live with. So we need to make sure that the solution makes sense for the people who are benefiting and the people who are maintaining it. There's also a couple of different ways in which a bid can be structured. So there's a little explanation here. We're essentially working with 3 different components here. There's a managed network that is being provided by a managed service provider. There's a cabling provider that actually goes on site and installs cables and access points and hardware. And then there's the backhaul connection, which is being provided by an internet service provider. These can be bundled. There are ISPs that do all 3. It's more common that an MSP will do the managed network and the installation. But in the case of Chelsea, these are 3 separate vendors with 3 separate contracts. And there's sort of a variety of advantages and disadvantages of how this is how this happens. All right. So finally, we move to contracting. In Chelsea, the city is the one that is signing the contracts and taking on the ongoing costs. And then MAPC transfers money to the city to pay for those. In this case, the city is also the one footing the bill for years 2 and 3, but that doesn't necessarily have to be the case. It could also be the housing authority or another entity. It's also worth noting that this can just take a little while because there are a lot of moving pieces. All right, so what's next? In Chelsea, everything is actually under contract. Matt told me that this week they started delivering equipment. We're expecting construction to start at the beginning or a week from Monday on May 8th. And we think that the network should be operational sometime in June. So in the meantime, we'll be shifting our focus towards developing educational and outreach materials to let people know that this network is available, it's free, how to use it. In the future, we'd also love to expand this network to serve the rest of Prattville, to serve the Woodies, which are that other half of this campus. And then statewide, we do have other projects at various stages ongoing in Revere and Quincy with public housing authorities, and then another one with a nonprofit housing developer in the city of Boston. We're also in the process of applying for a much larger grant from the Mass Broadband Institute to expand this work around the Commonwealth, not just within the MAPC region. And then we continue to do digital equity planning. So this is my last slide here, and I just wanted to take the moment to acknowledge that this is really a team effort. It's certainly not just me. It's not just me and Matt, but there's a whole team at MAPC, Chelsea Housing Authority, the City of Chelsea, and Mass Broadband Institute that makes this possible. I'll call out that Carl Allen from the City of Chelsea is also in the audience here as well. So thank you all for your help with this, and I'm looking forward to the discussion. So shall I pass it on or pass it back to Marvin?
Provoking questions.
How provoking? No, community is the center of the work, right? And so you guys have talked about planning, you've talked about engagement. How are you actually engaging those residents? And how are they finding comfort in you? Because trust is a huge gap. So I'd love for you to speak to that a little bit.
Yeah, absolutely. And that is something that is really important because, much as I said at the beginning, those 3 aspects of digital equity, like none of them matter if you don't have all 3 of them. None of that also matters if nobody knows how to use or wants to use or trusts the solution that you're putting in. I think that is one case where, on one level, our institutional partnerships, like our partnership with somebody like Matt, who is on the ground working with residents and is helping them out with any number of other things, is super important. It also, one of the recommendations that I referenced in the digital equity plan was to do these digital navigator programs that's sort of modeled after the idea of a healthcare navigator that would be a trusted person in your community that could help you sign up for healthcare. This would be somebody that you can go to as a resource and they can help you out, meet you at your level. But it's also really important that they understand why you're using the internet and they're making recommendations that make sense for you, because not the same technology or the same use case is appropriate for every different person. I think it's also really important to meet people where they are in terms of language access. It's hard enough to teach somebody how to use a computer, but to teach them how to use a computer in a language they don't really feel totally comfortable in is just impossible.
So what sort of question survey?
So the digital literacy piece is a little harder to measure. So I'll start with some of the access things. We're asking things like, are there ever times that not everyone who needs to be on the internet in your house is able to, either because of bandwidth issues or because you don't have enough devices? This becomes more of an issue when kids are going to school on Zoom at the same time that adults are trying to go to work on Zoom. We're also asking things like, have you had to make any changes to your internet service in the last 6 months because of cost issues? Have you had to replace a device that you have because of cost issues? Or have you had trouble replacing because of cost issues, rather? And then we're also just asking, do you feel comfortable getting the things done that you need to get done? And do you have a person that you can go to solve a problem when it comes up? If your device isn't working the way it wants to work, is there someone you can reach out to that you are confident can help you fix that problem? This is some of the sort of existing conditions evaluation that we did. I think that we're moving into a phase where we are thinking more about how do we onboard people to this new resource that's being made available for them in a way that is comfortable for them. So that is some training that is sort of, the development of that is sort of ongoing.
I guess I should have sat next to him, but next time. So a major thing is, and this isn't really data, but it's more kind of just talking to people. I realize that we have two white guys here who don't speak Spanish. The majority of my staff is actually Latina and Latino. They speak Spanish. Our property manager has been talking to people. I've been talking to people. That picture, actually, Will was in that picture. He came to our movie night in August, where we had an outdoor movie night in conjunction with the city, and we were promoting it at that movie night. We were doing research with Josh when he was still with MAPC at the previous movie night. I launched a resident council off of this work because we were already engaging with residents. And we just had a meeting, actually yesterday, I was in that office talking to the new resident councilors, and we were updating them on everything that's happening. And they're all very, very excited about this happening. So that's another way to build that trust, is we've just been talking about it. So when this thing hits the ground, it's not going to hit the ground out of nowhere. It's something that they're anticipating, people are expecting. And honestly, I started 2 months before the pandemic. And I know that one of the other fellow presenters is going to talk about access during the pandemic using the hotspots and things like that. We had a lot of people that were actually congregated around McDonald's trying to get their schoolwork done, trying to get their work done. We had employers for low-level jobs saying, oh, we'll just do a Zoom interview. And I had residents telling me, like, I don't know how to do that. I don't have this internet. So that's how we built that trust, was basically just talking to people. And as Will said, talking to them in a language that they understand. Because me talking at them without speaking Spanish, if they don't speak English, that's not going to do much. So we have people that actually know that language in that culture talking to them as well.
All right, so we'll go to
Real quick. Not off the hook just yet. So how are we transitioning them from their current, I'm assuming they're paid subscribers, correct? At this current point.
Some of them are. 25% of the people in the city of Chelsea don't even have broadband.
Okay.
And that number is going to be higher on our sites because the way how public housing works is state sites actually accept people that don't have documentation.
Yep.
So our state sites are going to be even higher concentration of people with English language skills on lacking that and lacking that broadband. So I'd say probably 60 to 70% of our residents probably already have broadband, but a good chunk of them don't have anything.
So the ones who have broadband, what's the transition going to be like for them? Is there a gap in service?
That's more of a Will question.
Okay.
The ones who already have broadband, and I don't have the numbers in front of me of how many that is, but
there's an assumption that their broadband is not adequate for service bandwidth, which is the reason why you're interested in transferring everyone. Instead of leaving some. So that's the reason.
It's not an assumption. It's not an assumption.
It's true. So I think that the idea here is that we are providing service at a level that is sufficient to do everything you need to do online. The idea, our original spec was to try to do 100 meg symmetrical, so 100 megabits up, 100 megabits down, which is, enough to do most things that a family would need to do from home. That is a relatively speaking, expensive level of service to purchase from an ISP. So the assumption is that if we are providing something for free that can fully replace at-home internet, there is an incentive to use that service rather than continuing to pay for private service.
My last question would be, just want to ask about sustainability. What is the sustainability plan for these residents? Because, as we keep community centered, we have to make sure that we're thinking about them for the long term. I just love you to close out on that.
Yeah, I think, the service is paid for for 3 years. It is sort of my personal hope that when people are provided with a service that is free, that is high quality, that they get used to, they will continue to expect for it to be provided. And that is something that I have had every indication from the city and the housing authority will continue to be provided. Thanks.
Maria will now present to us more on the usage of I'll do this. I think to Margaret's question, a lot more about the engagement and how to relate this.
I'm already the paper.
Oh, yes, sorry.
Maybe sports activated, but my name is Dina Maria Giraldo, and it's a pleasure to be here after being here all day and being the last panel. I'm like so honored to have this conversation. I'm so inspired by the last two panels that I've been here. So wonderful conversation to be part of. First of all, as I said before, I'm an assistant professor, but I'm also Colombian born, a Boston-based designer, interactive media artist, and a storyteller with a co-design, civic media, data art, and technology background. I know that's a big mouth words, but I think the most important is that I am a mother, although my kid is not there, it should be there. And I'm a mother, I am a Latina, she's probably behind the camera. I'm a Latina woman, immigrant, and I had learned by my own account what invisibility means, which leads to inaccessibility and lack of decision-making. I've seen how many my communities needs to be recognized and categorized accurately. Through my work, I have learned the importance of storytelling from the maker's perspective. So this, for me, is the perfect kind of combination. Civic engagement, data storytelling, affordable technology, and storytelling. The story is the inspiration for change, and technology is the tool to achieve it. We live in a world where technology is changing constantly, as you were saying, where digital accessibility is critical. And with digital accessibility, it's critical to own our own narrative. Data storytelling must include marginalized communities with a datification process, humanize the data from a hyperlocal perspective, data literacy focusing on environmental justice communities. When these steps are included in the process, it creates an opportunity to empower minorities, particularly the Latina community, with lower proficiency English, seniors, disabled, which do not trust media, talking about trust, particularly in this political realm. Communities must have access to affordable technology. Actually, it's fantastic to be right behind you because it's basically affordable technology, be able to build, design new technologies to facilitate the data collection process. Approach data storytelling from a maker and exploratory mind, such as creating devices that collect data with communities affected by environmental racism. From the civic perspective, we implement methodology to explore new ways to narrate stories from a participatory process with a human-centered design. We facilitate an environment of co-creation and change that challenge the narrative based on the community input. Community is everything. Without the community, we don't exist. The data doesn't exist. The story doesn't exist. So this is kind of where I'm coming and from where I'm coming from for the project that I'm talking today. It's called Data para Todos. Data literacy and the democratization of data. Data para Todos improve data literacy among the Latina community, and the main goal is to learn how to collect, analyze, explore, clean, visualize data to create stories about environmental justice within the community. The first instance of this project happened through a collaboration with a local nonprofit. Via workshops we held through last summer and fall. We work with first-generation Latina communities who were able to go to college. We have UMass, we have Amherst, and we have, oh my God, I just step out, we come back to me for a second, and this is in Somerville, Leslie University, that's what I was missing. And students to learn how to create working prototype sensors to collect indoor air quality and samples to analyze them. These students came from an organization called Bottom Line, which mainly work with first-generation students around the United States to help them to get through college and also to get through the jobs. The amazing cohort that you see right here behind is George Acosta-Lemus, Marvin Baez, and Jailene Goodmans. They learn how to build Arduino-based, and you can see them in the photo, sensors. They learn how to solder, they learn how to program, and the series of the workshops led to the creation of working sensors where we could create, we collected particulate matter, VOC, humidity, and temperature. Having in consideration that many of the sensors are created from scratch, we understand the margin of error that we are including, but the process of this and the ownership of this creation, it was an experience for the both parties. Why? Environmental justice affects minorities mainly, and it's not just air. We have housing through accessibility of transportation and access to cleaner. We have talked about cleaner in other different panels. And air is not equal. Indoor air quality depends on where you live. And as we have more sensors around us and we have more data, I keep seeing data, and we produce more data and we collect more data. But what we are missing is that ownership of the data, that consent of or creating our own data and telling our own stories. We have to have ownership over our own data. We need to tell and create our own perspective. The cohort, which was amazing. We started with 7, and some of them got COVID, some others have other issues, so we ended up with 3. So we were kind of, but the last 3, really, they were every morning working. We have also meetings at 8 a.m. in the morning on Fridays, learning how to visualize data. We work hours just to create those sensors, and they learn how to create and that they visualize the data. They learn how to use Excel. Some of them, many of them, they don't even know how to start with Excel. And Tableau, which is a very kind of common software to visualize the data. And with every involvement in the stages, we understand the value, the implications, where the data is coming from, and we were claiming ownership. The project really fostered and gained the data literacy skills, which was the main goal since the beginning. And we really want to use this data literacy skills to bring and tell stories from each one of the perspectives of who is involved in the cohort. The views that you have here, just to mention why are you looking at it there, we have the opportunity to complete the first step of this project with the Boston Cyber Arts Gallery, which is located in Jamaica Plain. And we use the gallery space as an immersive narrative to tell the data, to really move to the digital space, how we can create the data in a 3D environment. And we use the gallery space. We really have a co-creation process from the collection of the data, from the preparation of the sensors, and then also in the way how we are going to put the data together, how we are going to tell these stories. So what you saw here in the back is each one has, like, we have decals with the photos of each of them, and each one have like the data they collected. We also, from the indoor quality they created, we also compare it with purple air data, outdoor data from the area they were living. They came from the dorms of the house they were living, and the story that they want to create. They were incorporating photos and things that they want to highlight. Here, for example, this is an 18-feet wall of the data that is collected in the data. We have physical visual experience. This is a close-up where we are combining the data of everyone who participated. And we have temperature, humidity, VOC, PM, particulate matter of 2.5. And we kind of really project it, and we really want to have a kind of a textual opportunity to see how this affected. So we really moved from the digital realm to bring it into a more one-on-one experience. I'm confused with my device. As well, I think we really we cannot talk about air quality. We really not mention what is income, population, where are we located as the Latina community, and accessibility. And this is pretty much one of the different, like, when we are looking at this process, you can see this data came from the US Census. And we start thinking about understanding the geographic locations, highlight the income within the community. compare it with the other races. And as you can see here, actually it's right in the middle of the 4 screens, the Hispanic 12% of the population only made 48K. So we cannot tell one story without really connecting the other one. So we start kind of learning really and looking in the census data and really questioning the categorization of the data. Why is the data, like why Native people and Brazilian is still categorized under Hispanic? Why are we seeing the numbers? The numbers that we are seeing really are not portraying the stories that we are telling. So we have a lot of questions through that visualization process and how we are telling the stories. And this is another map that we created. I really debated if I should bring the interactive visualizations of the photo of the 2D visualization that we created. But this is a map that usually you don't see. This is where the Hispanic population is in Massachusetts. And I say Hispanic, I moved through Latine to Hispanic, and I'm not agree with the Hispanic kind of category, just to go and raise straight away. And this is my own perspective on this, because it's really missing a lot of conversation. It's erasing other people under this overall conversation. So here we can see where the Latinx community is located. And if we look in Framingham, the Framingham community, the Latinx community is pretty high. And I question again, what is this percentage? Where is the Brazilian community included here? Knowing that the percentage of the Brazilian community in Framingham is pretty high. So this is some of the questions that we are kind of questioning here. And I really don't wanna finish this conversation without saying thank you to many of the people who collaborated with this, starting with George, Jaylene. They couldn't make it today, but with Emerson College, Boston Cyber Arts, Bottom Line. I think the alignment of the goals of these 3 organizations allowed our collaboration of promoting data literacy, especially with environmental adjusting community. Thank you so much for listening to me.
Margaret asked a couple of questions and then
I'm ready for these.
And then
Excellent presentation. You're doing some magnificent work. And I'd love to see young people who are getting into the particulars of data collecting and the particulars around creating real change that, they can create symbolization for, but they can also speak to it from their own personal story. And so just one question I'm gonna ask. Ownership seems to be a core focus of the project. Right? How do you think schools, governments, and other institutions can create more community ownership of the data?
That's an excellent question. And I think I'm really thinking about that in the research that I'm doing. And I think my first answer really is about data literacy and knowledge. I think we need to include more knowledge. Just when I was listening to the environmental justice panel this morning, and I saw like 4,500,000 sensors of air quality in most public schools. And what are we doing with this data? So I think I actually see you there, and I was like, so amazing. So how can actually we just kind of bring this as part of the curriculum? How can actually we bring this conversation into the schools to start teaching what means data? Like, we produce data as we read, how we are bringing that conversation, how we are learning to tell a story. So I think it's all about that literacy and bringing it into the conversation.
I'm going to follow up. I know it was
That's totally fine.
How are you teaching the young people to have ownership of the data and to translate that data into something that is reflective of where they're going? Are you teaching them to think progressively about how to use this work versus just in the moment?
That's a good curriculum. So I think, and I think that also goes back a little bit of the collection process of the data. And I think I'm just gonna bring the example of the census and the categorization of it. I think the way that we start teaching this is questioning, like how they collected the data. how much access I have to that data, where currently you're using the data in my name to tell a story without my consent. So I think it's really just to bring that kind of critical thinking of why and knowing the why, how I can take decisions to forward and move forward. So I think that's what we need to focus.
Thank you.
So thank you.
Thank you. So welcome my colleague, Amy Mahler from Mayor's Office of Urban Mechanics.
Thank you. Great. So as you look at these like beautiful faces of our incredible Boston residents, I'd love to ask the group, actually, our panel, but also our audience, like a quick little series of questions. Can you raise your hand if you learned how to use the internet via like AOL Instant Messenger or that sort of platform? Raise your hand. Great. For how many of you would you say that your computer is integral to your job? Okay. How many of you use FaceTime or similar like face messaging software like that? Great. Okay. The reason why I asked those series of questions was I wanted us to like really think about how the demands of the lives that we currently lead ask us to incorporate technology and force us to be data literate to participate in the lives that we are currently leading and the parts of society that we are existing in. So as I start talking about this incredible program that I was lucky enough to work on in partnership with the Boston Housing Authority and the Boston Public Library, it's called the Long-Term Lending Program. I just really wanted everyone to think about like, where are we operating from, especially as we're designing programs. So this was the photo on the left is from the Mary Ellen McCormick, which is a public housing site, formerly BHA, but is mostly managed by one of the property management companies. I believe it's Winco. I could be wrong, so correct. I apologize if I am. And then to the right is one of our residents who really benefited from this program. I know she's so glamorous. And so long-term lending program, it started just before I joined this team at the city, but basically it was through CARES Act dollars, and the Boston Public Library basically got a ton of money and was like, we know that the people who were the most isolated during the pandemic were the people who did not have access to technology, because literally being in the same room as somebody was dangerous. And so as we were developing this program and thinking about how to bring it to residents, our hypothesis was really by providing free technology and internet to those vulnerable residents, especially those in public housing. Can we give them greater opportunity for community connection? Can we give them greater resilience? By that, I mean giving them the tools to develop those skills, hopefully by us giving them resources, but also, you know, doing what we hope good programs do, which is let people find their full potential on their own terms by making a burden not something that they have to worry about anymore. And so the timeline for the program was December of 2021 to November 22. We gave over 9,000 pieces of technology, so over 6,000 Chromebooks, 3,000 routers, and we partnered with over 29 community-based organizations with totally different identities, totally different constituencies that we've served. I think one of the biggest things that we took away in the program, so we had, from December of 2021 to about the end of April 2021, we exclusively focused on Boston Housing Authority residents. We really wanted to make sure that the residents that we, the city of Boston, are responsible for, that we care for, that we know that if we do the outreach, we can have real permeation into this community, that we can connect with them the most. But we also recognize, as I hope every good government can, that there are a lot of different people who don't trust government. And that is completely fair, because there are a lot of parts of the world where the government are not the good people. And sometimes we're not even the best people. I'm great, but But I think we're very lucky in that, we have a lot of really wonderful colleagues, but we understand that we do not have expertise. And so we need to partner with people who do have that expertise, and hopefully make it worth their time, worth their while. So this is just some of the social media content. We also provided this content in multiple, with the city of Boston. If you're not familiar, we have a language and communications access ordinance. So we have, I believe it's like 9 or 10 threshold languages that we translate everything through. So we also put this content in those languages as well. And so our target audience, like I said, was public housing residents, senior citizens, just thinking about like the folks who were, like I said, the most socially isolated, the most vulnerable, but also like aren't already probably making that investment of technology or don't immediately have access. So like, we could have structured this program to like target children, but then I would just be replicating what Boston Public Schools is doing because they already gave kids Chromebooks during the pandemic. And often if they needed it, also gave them hotspots or routers, depending on what was that investment at that time. So I think a part of this was also like, what are the parts of society that we're not able to currently meet their need? The target audience also included the post-BPS students. So once a student graduates from BPS, they no longer have access to that Chromebook that they learned on. And that was something that I got really furious about, quite frankly. Some of my colleagues and friends who are in the room can tell you that my best work comes out when I'm really mad. I'm much like Mark Ruffalo's Hulk in that fashion. But, so we specifically partnered with like community-based organizations that especially targeted community college youth. I'm of course forgetting the organization right now because that would be helpful to you. And then we also focused on recent migrants and refugees, so especially folks where documentation was just not something that, their home government was good enough or trusted or in the position to be able to help them with, or we, the American government, were either too overwhelmed, couldn't do it, or also couldn't be trusted in those conversations as well. And so I mentioned up here Haitian migrants and Afghan refugees in particular. And in particular, I want to acknowledge IFC, who helped us in particular with connecting with our Haitian migrant neighbors, and then ICNA with our Afghan refugee neighbors. And so the folks who qualified were Boston Public Library card holders. It's free to sign up. You just need to give us an address and an email for the e-card. You can obviously, you can also go into your local public library and get a physical card. I think it's notable to say that the library is the most trusted public institution in America. And I think that's one of the reasons why you're seeing libraries across the country do digital equity work, is because we trust them. We have so many stories of like leaders, both internally to City Hall and then across the country, where like the library is where you learned how to speak English. The library was where when your parent had a job, they were able to drop you off and they could take advantage of story time so that they could go and do their work and feel like their child was being taken care of. And that trust is something that we take very seriously. You had to be over the age of 18. And then originally our pool was exclusively Boston residents. This was opened up in our summertime to the Metro Boston Library Network and then Chelsea and Malden Public Schools. I think I just hit on this a little bit earlier about like why BHA first. Obviously you're hearing some similar tones with Will and Matt's incredible work. But we have we as government have a responsibility to the people who are in public housing. They are literally means tested often to be in that housing, and helping them be connected. And also just like more and more services and more communications are coming online digitally. And by giving these people this tool, this mechanism to be able to connect to those resources, we will then be doing a better job of serving our residents. I was in a city council hearing talking about winter placemaking, and literally City Council President Ed Flynn specifically was like, well, how do we make sure that these resources, I am not going to imitate a South Boston accent. How do we make sure that these resources get to the children who are in public housing? And I thought to myself, like, Council President, I don't always agree with you on things, but that is a fabulous question. And I would say to that, before this program, how could we make sure that seniors in public housing had access to programs and resources? Because children will probably, they might not be interested in civic avenues because I too would rather play Minecraft than go to a community meeting. But thinking very seriously, like the children are not going to be intimidated by getting email. It's whether or not we can interest them, which is a whole separate question about whether or not we structure government and meetings and information in a way that's actually interesting to people. That's a different panel. So our methods of outreach for this program were 2 separate BHA wide mailings to all of our residents. We had over 9,000 recipients. Like I said, those were available in multiple languages, so it was a very long letter. But thankfully, BHA is a really incredible logistical partner. If you were not already blown away by what you heard about the Chelsea Housing Authority and MAPC's partnership and what they were able to accomplish, BHA, knock your socks off. They also did the distribution of the devices within BHA themselves. So all of our devices came from our provider to BHA central office, and then were split apart into the 5 main sectors of BHA housing and then distributed directly to the buildings themselves. So when somebody would fill out the form for this program, they could select their own BHA site, and that helped us better organize how they got their devices, but also make sure that the devices weren't going to get stolen or get lost, which was important. Also in that, when we were saying that conversation about trust earlier, logistics are a big part of trust. They're also terrifying. We did signups directly at BHA sites, especially at Unity Days, which are they're very much designed to bring everybody in. And then usually whoever's the management company or even BHA themselves will have tons of entertainment. They're usually intergenerational, and there's free food, which is crucial. And then also BPL branch librarians are heroes in society, and we could not have done this without them. They're perfect. This is me smiling at residents because I love them and I'm obsessed with them. The left is from the Mary Ellen McCormick Unity Day, and then the right is at the Doris Bunty housing and Eggleston area. And I think something that I didn't mention earlier was also that each one of our signups, we also made sure to have BHA has an incredible translation team, and they joined us at every one of our signups, and whatever were the major populations of those buildings, of those languages, they had a translator who was able to speak that. So when I was signing up people at Torre Unidad in South End, we had folks who spoke Mandarin, and then we also had folks who spoke Spanish. If you've ever been to Torre Unidad in the South End, you know that it was the Mandarin translator that was in primary use, which is hilarious when you consider that it's called Torre Unidad, which is non-Mandarin. This was our map request list by zip code. You can see that the majority of our requests came from Roxbury, Dorchester, Mattapan, and also East Boston. I think that's also, again, a reflection of both need, but also the level of outreach we did, and then the amazing community partners. There are just some community partners where they know the game of getting resources out to their constituents, and they're incredibly good at it. I will say that Dudley Square Neighborhood Initiative, John Smith, who was one of the partners here at BARI, his organization was one of our first partners to sign on, and it's because we have such a high level of trust in their excellence. What worked is that, community members were most excited about, we had a smaller program that led into this that was we had 200 hotspots that we gave away. People were so much more jazzed about hotspots. They're so much more intuitive, and also mobile internet matters so much more to residents than being able to use internet specifically in their home. But I would say, or at least that was a takeaway that jumped out at me, because I was thinking about it, especially from the perspective of people live lives on the go, especially if they were cooped up in their houses or their apartments for a year and a half. Real. I totally get that. Also, when we're talking about a fixed income population, data allowances are something that's very real. Nobody wants to get overage charges. If you have a Wi-Fi hotspot in your pocket, you don't have to worry about that. And I would love to live in a universe where I don't have to worry about my residents getting charged extra just because they decided to spend 5 more minutes on FaceTime with their grandchild. And then I would also say, this is not shocking to anybody who's done direct community engagement, but our direct signups were, they were crucial. Literally, that was how we were able to really figure out major pieces of you actually don't. So a population that didn't love Chromebooks as much were our Chinese and Mandarin speaking populations, because they use a character-based language in their native language. And a Chromebook is not as flexible to character-based languages as, say, other tablets. But that said, I can get huge quantity of free resources for constituents if I'm choosing Chromebook over arguably other tablets. So if that's a provocateur question, I would say that that is a very, very real question. And were I the one who had bought these tablets, that is something I would have factored into it. I think another piece that didn't work out as well as expected, we really did underestimate how much of a barrier digital hesitancy was around less Chromebooks, honestly. They were a little bit more like hotcakes, but routers. They were like, it was amazing to me. I literally had a constituent. I was signing him up. I was talking to, we had a translator who spoke Portuguese right next to me. The guy was FaceTiming his wife, asking for the password to his email so that he could sign up for this free program. It's like, he's FaceTime. He's like, we live in the future. Does anybody ever realize how weird that is sometimes? Like, we live in the future where you can FaceTime your family member who lives in a totally different country so you can ask them for your email password. That is crazy. And I say that just not to sound too dramatic, but I just think it's amazing, like how much technology that we all depend on has developed itself, that we as society, private companies have developed technology so that adoption is so easy, but it does make recruitment for some of these tools much harder. I wish that signing somebody up for a community program with their consent and full knowledge was as easy as like showing somebody how to, use FaceTime. And then I think the sort of final piece was that Chromebooks have a limited use without internet access. They're really great internet surfing tools, but if you have needs for Chromebook for your device beyond the internet, it's hard. And then also if you don't have the internet, you're signing up for a Chromebook that you'll only be able to use in limited spaces. These are photos from ICNA. They're the Islamic cultural, I'm so sorry, I forget the name of the acronym, but basically they're an incredible group that supports Islamic neighbors, and they're out of the Islamic Society Center of Boston and Roxbury, which is a beautiful space if you haven't been. Ahmad Nazar, who's there, is a miracle worker. And this is like folks who are, because they used our program, they were able to take free language lessons. They were able to get the resources that they needed when they were coming here from Afghanistan, and we bungled that. I know, bold, gripping political statements. But that I think it's like very valid to say that like sometimes we as municipal government can step in where other parts of our government drop the ball. I don't know how many times vice versa that happens, but this was a nice moment in that we were able to step in and help our neighbors when they needed us. These are some nice comments from our participants. We especially were able to connect this program to a lot of our nonprofits helping our unhoused neighbors and folks who are in recovery. And so you can really hear like this piece of like job training, job security, like, my families who are intergenerational needing access to greater pieces of technology or more pieces of technology so that somebody who's working from home can also be learning in the same space as somebody at home. And they can all do it at the same time. And also just like this saving money piece, like the internet is expensive. Devices are expensive, and saving money for residents is worth their time. What's next? So we're going to continue to keep pushing things to the residents to the American Connectivity Program. The free internet on the routers ends December of this year. But so we're using this as a tool to recruit people to the Affordable Connectivity Plan as they're interested. And then the BPL hosts computer and tech literacy classes, as you can see above, and they're at different branch libraries across the city. And also we're anticipating to receive more funding to further support ACP enrollment, telehealth programming, digital skills training, and then improve our data and digital gaps. And we're excited to see what's next. Thank you. I did try to tailor a lot of that information, hopefully in anticipation for it. I find, Albus Dumbledore, probably a canceled person, once said, never tickle a sleeping dragon, but you're very awake and I'm ready. Ooh, such a good question. It took us over 10 months to get the full distribution out of the devices. I was incredibly satisfied with the responses we got from constituents. But I will say, in terms of impact, if your question is how many of those folks who we signed up for those devices then went and took Tech Goes Home classes or other kinds of programs, I know. You do. But I think that's a very valid question, in that we didn't put in a digital literacy learning requirement for these devices. And this was a very high trust program. Somebody just had to have a Boston address and a Boston Public Library card. And that was very intentional, so that we could get devices out to people. And also, if somebody decided that they didn't want that device after they got it because the barrier was too big for them, even though we're sending them resources, we're sending them information, we're making it as clear as possible, that's okay. We have to, part of consent means no is also in that conversation. But I hope that kind of answers your question. Uh-huh. Mm. I love that you asked that question. So if you look right in that photo, right next to that little Chromebook, we have basically an explainer that has listed all of the numbers and information necessary. And I believe, let's see. So we've got the phone numbers right here. And I believe on the back we have translated, simplified version of this in other languages as well. I don't know why I had to stand up. I felt compelled. But yes, so the answer is we made sure that all these devices had that information directly with it as well. Because if we just said scan this QR code, then we're assuming that people have phones. Exactly. They know how to scan, that they have phones with a camera screen in them. Rude, presumptuous. Yeah.
Or are you saying that when you're distributing, they're able to keep it down
The answer that what we wrote in the language was borrow them for as long as you want, period. And the reason why we use that language was we can recognize that some people may have a time-bound interest to learn on a free device, and maybe they would then want to purchase something else and they don't need that device anymore. They'd like to give it back. And then there are residents where this is what they want to keep. But we say nowhere on here, we say nowhere on our other public communications that anybody needs to return these devices. They are yours as long as you need them. Yeah. Mm. Mm-hmm. So we have, I believe, so there's been some conversation. So this is a little preemptive. So there's been some conversations between, I believe, Boston Public Library and Boston Housing Authority on offering some digital literacy programming, some computer training in certain BHA sites. That's still being developed, and that's also about capacity right now. Our community learning team at the BPL, incredible human beings. They are still hiring folks for some of these different positions. But It's a great question. We certainly, BHA is trying to provide more of these resources directly on site. They do some of that programming in person already through their own resources. But I also very much want to give a shout out to the Digital Equity Fund that is run through Santi Shop, where they fund community-based organizations that are trying to bring digital equity programming, devices, literacy, et cetera, to community-based organizations like Prince Hall and all these other incredible community groups that have level of buy-in. Because like I said, it's not just BHA residents who were able to sign up and access for this program. It was beyond the BHA universe as well. And then if I remember correctly, yes, we also had designed the interface for the Google Chromebook that it would also have resources on the homepage that people could then link and then go to. And I think there was also some other community-based resources. But I think one of the homepages that we set up was tech literacy classes for BPL, that webpage that was on the screen a while ago. So the only timeout that existed in the program was all of the devices being claimed. Is that what you mean? Okay, cool. Then yes, there's no limit. They can use the devices as long as they last as identified. Chromebooks, they break. But yes, cool. Thank you.
Great job from our provocateur, from our panelists. So I figured maybe we open up for some conversation. The audience might have questions or provocations that they want to share with the panel. Then we have until 4:45, so maybe 5 minutes before I'll try to synthesize and add some value beyond just being here. So I have people have questions, thoughts.
All fascinating, love all the presentations. Oh my God, one rule here. Maybe this one. Who's okay?
I can hear you.
Okay. I'll just try this one just in case. Yes. Okay, better. My question for Lena is, I was curious, I love the vertical integration you had going on where they literally start and build the sensor all the way to curating the data. Which part of the process did the students appreciate? Did different students appreciate different parts? And did the fact that they were doing all the parts of it make them if there wasn't some part that they liked, there was something to I just love how you did all of the different parts. What did they like the most?
What they like the most?
Yeah.
We all want to hear you.
Thank you. Well, I think all of them have different challenges, and all of them brought satisfaction and failure and frustration. So I think to just put it in that way, I think when you actually pass that frustration moment is where they like the most. And for example, when they were building the sensors, a lot of the things didn't work, or because it's a lot of failure and error. When the things start moving on and when they start seeing the data and when they start kind of understanding, that is where is and that's a happy moment. I think they also seeing the whole work together, that was also another moment that I think that's where they like the most. But it's definitely not a straight line. It's more like a lot of emotions throughout the process.
Which one works?
So I'm eye contact. Hi, Amy, and everybody else. I'll probably also talk to Will, but mostly Amy. So as someone, I don't have anything to do with digital equity, but I think it's a really important problem. But I do have worked in a whole building full of old Hispanic people, and Hispanic because mostly from Dominican Republic. And I have designed with the help of community partners and researchers this program of air purifiers, and it was all email based and it was all internet based to sign up. It had translations, so that part was covered, but no person in this building, except for one, because the son lived with them, had an email, or even like knew how to scan a QR code. So we switched to like door knocking and papers, and they couldn't even write their names on paper because a lot of these people didn't have them fine-tuned skills. So my question is more about like what options and flexibility is built into your program. Because knowing my people, I call them my people now, because like I've spent so much time with them that I feel like they're my family. Knowing my family, if I gave them this option, I talked them about this program, 99% of them would say, can you just give me a phone so I can call my family? Or can you just give me, if I need, internet would be great for WhatsApp because they all use WhatsApp to call family. But I really cannot deal with any of this stuff. So I wonder if there's any options, flexibility built into the program for.
Thank you. I love that you asked that question because I think that's so before I started working in public service, so I've been in like government since about 2013, but before that I used to run campaigns. And if anybody who's knocked a door or run a campaign before, our bread and butter is talking to a human being, get the read on their pulse, decide if it's a yes or no, and then you figure it out from there. And the best part about moving to government coming from that place is you recognize that there are people who are able to do all the skills that you were good at in a political arena, but they have it in community-based organizations. In particular, for when we were focusing on especially the Boston Housing Authority residents, they have such powerful tenants organizations, and they're incredible. The Charlestown Residents Association is just like one of the most incredible groups of people. Isaac put on this killer event. We had a 50-person line wrapping around a basketball court. And why? It was because neighbors know each other. They know who's on the tenant. They know who's on the tenant board. I literally, I was like walking to the event, like with my flyers, with like my box of Kind bars. And I was like, oh, ma'am, like I saw a woman. I was like, oh, ma'am, are you, have you heard about our sign? She's like, I'm on the tenants board. You're welcome. And then walked away. And like that is community. And so to answer your question, like, yes, I like, there is like and it's actually like one of the things I really struggle with as we like look at digitizing like more and more city services and state services and federal services. Like the Affordable Connectivity Program is like basically like this generation of government's attempt to get everybody on the internet in the way that like, I think it was the Clinton administration, might have been one of the Bush administrations, launched Lifeline to make sure that every American had access to a telephone for emergency services. But that does mean that there are these whole generations of people. And when we asked that question earlier about like, what is everybody's level of like digital literacy? I mean, I imagine for your people that you were talking about, and then plenty of folks, they never needed to use a computer in any of their jobs. They have never even needed to have an email. And now we live in a world where that's almost inconceivable. And so that was very much why we like focused on community-based organizations, and also started with public housing first, where we had those residents organizations, but also had like on-site managers and staff who were able to spread the word for us. And that's why we also leveraged, Unity Days and then the coffee hours, because they were like real people knew that they were coming. They knew that they existed. So really taking advantage of like existing social infrastructure, and then also that reliable events infrastructure that they could go to and depend on. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Carl Allen. I'm a city planner in the city of Chelsea, and all of this digital equity sits on my desk at the moment. Thank you, Marvin, for that question on sustainability, because that is not solved. We're doing one housing authority property in Prattville. Our previous city manager committed to 2 years of funding so that the contract could be signed.
Thank you for that, by the way.
But we can't replicate that and permanently pay Wi-Fi out of the city budget for every low-income resident in Chelsea. That is not a sustainable model. And Comcast has totally failed us. We are the victims of a market failure. ACP is a Band-Aid at best.
Couldn't agree more.
And it's for bad service. It's whatever the minimum they can get away with, and then it's only up to, so they don't have to even give them that. But so does Boston have any ideas? I can share how I'm thinking about sustainability, but I'm curious, you're deep into this.
I'm deep into it, but Santi's even deeper into it. Sorry, Santi, go ahead.
Passing it off to somebody.
Yeah.
Thanks.
I mean, and maybe this is a good segue because we only have 5 minutes left. So look, I think there's questions around sustainability and scale. I think when we look at the data, particularly in Boston, ISPs are able to provide a sufficient level of access. Obviously, quality of service depends on how many people, and similarly with Will, if you're sharing a hotspot between 5 households, the quality of the internet depends on how many people are connecting at any given time. So, but based on the data that we have, we believe that the ISPs are able to provide a sufficient level of service. Now, the affordability piece is where we think that ACP comes in very handily. The city of Boston is receiving over $12 million a year for free connectivity that the city nor the Commonwealth has to put up with. It's because we have over 34,000 subscribers to ACP in the city. So it's not a trivial amount of money that we're getting from the federal funding through ACP. That being said, I think that we are looking at what's happening in Chelsea as the beginning of, and Urban Edge in Boston is looking at having, like we've been talking about, one of the themes that I get here is the shift of, is digital equity infrastructure public infrastructure, the same that a road, the same that a sidewalk. The sidewalks are a little bit special, right? Sometimes are the property of the property owner. But so there does seem to be a theme both in the devices and in the access to connectivity, particularly looking at people that live in affordable housing. Seems like the answer, at least the arrows are pointing towards, it's the public's responsibility to ensure that people have access when they choose to, and we still have ways to go to getting it in the way that is the most impactful and useful for them. I think, so long story short, for high density urban dwellings, I think that increasing the availability of competition within the affordable housing units, increasing the availability of a free Wi-Fi alternative is kind of what we are looking for. And I think that there's ways of creating a structural subsidy for that, but it doesn't start working when you go to scattered site and you start going to some places where you don't have the density per household to serve. That's my take on it. But again, like many of the things that we do, we will continue to have to think about how is it that with limit, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, you have the advantage that you can think of competition as an option. In Chelsea, it doesn't exist, and no one wants to provide it.
But yes, I have worked in other places, but Marvin, do you want to provoke on this one?
I won't provoke.
You're saying that the competition doesn't exist, it's only Comcast. Effectively, is there any other options?
We've asked Verizon. They said, how much will you pay us?
Okay.
So if you remember a couple of years ago, Mayor Walsh made that move, and some of you guys are probably involved in it. And he said you can't get to the wealthy neighborhoods unless you go through Dorchester and Roxbury. We're Dorchester and Roxbury, with no Mayor Walsh, no Boston, no Mayor Wu behind us.
And no wealthy neighbors.
And they refuse, and no wealthy neighbors you have to go through. So they refuse to basically build that infrastructure because it's too expensive and they don't think they can recoup that money. So we didn't have that advantage that of having the wealthy neighborhoods to. And like I said, that was an amazing thing that Walsh and probably you guys were involved in, did for your lower income neighborhoods.
Our predecessors did that, but good.
I'm late, I came late, so sorry about that. I don't, this is sort of tangentially related and this is not gonna be answered now, but I just wanted to throw it out. And that is, I've been in a lot of discussions around EVs and the grid and community benefit and EJ, environmental justice, and it is tied into connectivity. And when this and national grid and all of that stuff is going to become very important for communities to be engaged and how it affects them in all kinds of different ways. So obviously we can't discuss this now, but this came to mind. Just even one tiny little example is that somebody is a Grubhub guy from Turkey, is a Grubhub driver in our household, and he can get EVs from wherever, from his employer, and he plugged in his EV to my housemate's plug, and it charged up the wazoo to her bill. And these, even just that little micro issue could explode if communities are not engaged with these kind of processes, and where the charging stations are going to be. And anyway, so I don't mean to throw this out there at the end, but it made me think about it. So
It's,
do you want to take it?
oh, well, I was gonna wrap this up because we happen to be at time. Yeah, maybe a topic for next year's BARI conference.
Planning on that city right now. It's very early stages. I am talking about something that it's not even on our website yet, so. Be chill.
And
So like, this is one of the reasons why the federal government has dumped so much money into like, making electrification like in the wild for municipalities to invest in. It's why we're, the Biden administration is advocating hard for car companies. But you're totally right. Community needs to say what they want. It's also up to when I was in the Patrick administration, we were really pushing, especially like large campus employers back when that was a thing, hilarious. Universities, et cetera, to have charging on site specifically, so we wouldn't have to worry about the direct residential burden, but it's worth bringing up to your municipality. There's definitely folks who are thinking about it, whether or not they have capacity. That's a big reality.
Yeah, and there are a lot of secondary equity issues in there.
Yeah, for sure.
Particularly with people who don't have driveways.
yeah, so well, I like. No, there's like everything. I'll just wrap us up and say like thank you. Let's do a round of applause for our panel and our provocateur. I'll just wrap up by saying, look, the issues that we discussed, there's also some other sides to the issue. There's some research that has shown that elderly adults that are primarily communicating via digital tools feel more lonely than people that have in-person experiences. During the pandemic, we also saw that some of the online learning led to, so whether it's the pandemic itself or is the digital component, these are just, there's not single-handedly a positive aspect, but we know that it is so important to even some people that are participating online in this discussion because they couldn't be here in person. So hopefully this is so engaging that next year, this is the first year that we have a digital equity panel. So maybe next year we'll have a EV digital equity remix panel. But thank you all for coming.
That was my job.
Carl, I have the same concerns though. Yeah. The cow, that's the main. I'll be honest, I was kind of excited about screwing Comcast. And Comcast ended up being the person who bought me. But it's like, I feel like, the careful, I thought we were gonna screw Comcast. Still get that money.